going to learn is all about the incredible work of drug science, and it is the achievements of drug science, folks, is absolutely extraordinary. So as James said, I'm Professor of Psychopharmacology at the University of Manchester. However, I have given up my own research to focus on psychedelic medicine. And I've been a researcher for 30 years, and that, folks, was my dream. That's all I wanted to do. So why would I do that at this not particularly early stage of my career, folks? So to devote the rest of my career to psychedelic medicine. So I've worked in drug discovery for psychiatry in all my career, one way or another, in pharma, but mainly in academia. So what does that mean? So I'm an animal researcher, and I've been looking with drug companies for better medicines for psychiatry, for hard to treat psychiatric conditions for all my career. And, you know, don't get me wrong, I've worked on some amazing projects, some brilliant projects, some really clever molecules, great drug targets with some really clever scientists in industry. But actually, in terms of patient benefit, we haven't come very far. And actually producing drugs onto the market that are making a big difference for patients. And I would say psychiatry drug discovery hit a brick wall about 15 years ago when Big Pharma pulled out of this area. And there were some spectacular failures in large phase 3 trials, folks, and that costs up to $1 billion. And that meant that lots of the big players pulled out of this. It's too hard, and they're focusing on the other areas. And I would say we've had, compared to other disciplines, not a great deal of innovation and huge success in terms of patient benefit. However, things are changing, and plant medicines are changing all this, and we're going to learn a bit more about that this evening. I would say at the moment, folks, we're experiencing a paradigm shift in healthcare that is extraordinary. Okay, so that's why I decided to shift my career. But how as an academic am I going to do this? Research is really all I understand. So I got interested in drug policy and how that needs to be changed because of obstacles I met as a researcher in researching drugs that sit in Schedule 1. Psychedelics have been in Schedule 1 for 50 years, and cannabinoids. And that means that you need a special license to do anything with these potential medicines. And that's hugely restricted and has stopped many people doing research. So that's kind of where this started for me. And then I got interested in psychedelic medicine, and I'd explain to you in a minute why exactly. So I took a sabbatical from my academic life to learn as much as I could about psychedelics from some of the world leaders in this field. Of course, David Nutt being one of them, and I saw him on the screen. He's the boss, folks. But I think for all of us, it's probably the personal stories that really change maybe our path in life and our opinions. And I met a friend of my daughter's, actually, a combat veteran who used to have PTSD. He is a former paratrooper who served in Afghanistan. And actually, I have his story with me. He wrote it all down for me. I don't think we'll have time. We maybe have time to go there. But I spent a couple of hours talking to him, and to cut a long story short, he came back from Afghanistan. His sort of vision for his life changed, and he decided to go back to university and study, and wanted to do medicine. But he couldn't, because he started to struggle with his mental health, not sleeping, hypervigilant, and that, actually he describes it as, I tried to reg it out, so the nightmares when he tried to sleep, so he tried not to sleep, and his mental health just got from bad to worse, considered suicide. And because he was a paratrooper, he'd spent quite a lot of time in America, and with American soldiers, the Green Berets, and they talked to him about psychedelics, psilocybin in particular. So he'd learned a lot about this, smart guy, read up a lot about it, and things got to a head where his girlfriend said, you have to do something about this, you know, we can't carry on. And he went to Amsterdam in a hotel room with his girlfriend, took 2 doses of truffles, and this high doses, and this is not to be recommended. You know, you need a lot of psychological support, you need experts to be with you, the way clinical trials are being run at the moment. But he didn't have that option, and he didn't have the money to go on a, you know, an expensive retreat or anything. However, he came out of that experience well, and he was able to go into crowded places, and actually as early as that weekend he was able to go and do a bit of sightseeing. I had saw him about a year after that experience, and he hadn't had another experience with a psychedelic, and he was still well. So folks, I don't think you can hear those kinds of stories without wanting to enable people like him to access these medicines to heal them on the NHS. And the shame of that was he had to pay, he had to go to Holland, and he had to do this without any psychological support. And he had, you know, given his life for us, for his country. So that's kind of where one of the things that really, really shifted this for me, and of course talking to the experts and David Nutt. So I decided to run a couple of studies at the University of Manchester, one on psilocybin in combat veterans, interviewing them about their trauma and how psilocybin had helped them. That's a paper in review now, and another on Schedule 1 barriers to research because of, you know, the difficulties I had experienced. Learned an awful lot about that, and that study is about to come out in Drug Science Policy and Law. So that will be on the website, Drug Science website, very soon, I hope, James. The next study we're going to do is psilocybin for anxiety in people with a life-threatening diagnosis, like a cancer diagnosis. And actually that's where this work all started in the 50s and 60s. It's all qualitative interviewing research. So that's sort of some contribution, I think, as an academic that I can do. So what about psychedelics then? There are 4 key aspects of psychedelic medicine that I tell people when I'm out and about talking to people. So they heal people, like that combat veteran. In psychiatry we have many medicines, but we manage symptoms. We talk about managing symptoms. We don't talk about healing people and actually curing people. Of course, some people take a medicine and then they don't need to take it again, but it's not that's not kind of the framework that we work with. So that's extraordinary, to have a medicine that people can take maybe even once every 6 months or a year, and they're kind of well. They're left out of this experience without the diagnosis that they once had, the illness. It's a treatment that you don't have to take every day, so that's another extraordinary paradigm shift. And what that means is that you don't have the big side effect burden that you're bound to have with any medicine that you have to take on a regular basis. And drugs are not without risks, of course, people. The effects are very long lasting. Like with this veteran, I was talking to him a year later and he hadn't had another psychedelic experience and he was still well. And he's just going into the 2nd year of medicine now. And that, you know, the remarkable effects, the way they impact the brain, the neuroplasticity effects, that's likely to be due to this. But that's kind of extraordinary. And they're remarkably safe. But, you know, no medicine is without risks. But Albert Hofmann, who synthesized LSD in 1938, lived to be 102. He took a fair amount of it. And we've been doing research on this at Drug Science. There's, of course, a cardiac risk because of the pharmacology of psychedelics, the 5-HT2B, because they're serotonergic. They hit the serotonergic system. You've all heard of the 5-HT2A receptor activation, I'm guessing, caused by psychedelics. But the 2B activity does present a cardiac risk if you've got that pathology. And of course, in clinical trials, we're very, very careful to avoid people with that pathology. And there are companies developing new psychedelics, they're calling them 2nd generation psychedelics, that won't have that pharmacology. It's very important to be clear that this is not a medicine on its own. So we talk about psychedelic assisted therapy. So they talk about set and setting. So you have to have the right mindset. Like this combat veteran, he'd spent an awful lot of time researching, trying to understand psychedelics. And of course, he had no prior experience. Most combat veterans, don't have much experience or any experience with drugs. It's just not kind of the mindset and so on. And setting, you have to be in the right place with the right people, and preferably with your medical professionals. And what we're talking about here is an altered state of consciousness. So what I would point you to a couple of landmark clinical trials in this area. So one of them was conducted by David Nutt very recently with Robin Carhart-Harris for serious depression, and that's where they compared psilocybin to escitalopram, which is a new generation antipsychotic and probably the best that there is. So those results are extraordinary, how well psilocybin fared against a traditional standard medicine, but a pretty good one. And the MAPS phase 3 trial with MDMA, so ecstasy for severe PTSD. And again, extraordinary results, people. 90 people in that trial. It's a big phase 3 trial. And after that, their treatment, 67% of those people no longer met the diagnosis for PTSD. Extraordinary results. So we are seeing the results of clinical trials now in this area, and they're proving to be effective for these very hard to treat psychiatric conditions. So for many people where nothing else works, treatment-resistant depression, PTSD like this veteran, anxiety and depression that occurs in terminal patients or people with a terminal diagnosis. And actually that story started well in the past, the 1960s and 70s. Some of the guys who did those studies are still around. It's great. Drug dependence, extraordinarily difficult to help people with substance use or misuse, diagnosis with difficulties. Alcohol and nicotine dependence, those results are starting to come out now, extraordinary. OCD, and one of the most recent trials, Meg Spriggs at Imperial for anorexia. And if you talk to psychiatrists, that's a fear for them. It's so hard to treat people with an illness like anorexia. And for all these disorders, it must be so hard to be a healthcare professional and to not have enough tools to help people. And here we have such an amazing opportunity, folks, to help people where we haven't been able to before. So the other really exciting aspect of psychedelic therapy is neurological disorders that are also very, very hard to treat. The research here is earlier stage. It's more the sort of work I'm more familiar with, the animal work. But there's evidence that psychedelics are powerfully anti-inflammatory, and of course there are lots of disorders characterized by inflammation, neuroinflammation, systemic inflammation, and disorders like inflammatory bowel disease, asthma. I mean, it's early stage, but it's exciting, really exciting times. And other disorders like traumatic brain injury, stroke even, cluster headache, which is also called suicide headache, some really nice evidence emerging there, and chronic pain. So we're here to talk about drug science. So I have the honour of being chair of Drug Science's Medical Psychedelics Working Group. And Dave, I see you've your camera off, but this is such a brilliant opportunity for me, and I'm absolutely loving it. And drug science, there he is. It's great. Drug science has 3 working groups, and I see David Badcock, of course, who runs drug science with David Nutt, and of course with the team, with James and the team, has 3 working groups, and you're going to hear about the work of the other 2 working groups as well. And the achievements of drug science, folks, are extraordinary, and they achieve for patient benefit and providing evidence that no government is doing this. So we should be so grateful to have David, who is a legend, and working with him and the team is the best thing I've ever done, because we are achieving so much, and where governments just aren't. So the Psychedelics Working Group, then, we've been working for over a year, running for over a year. It's an international team, folks, and with the best. And all the working groups have the best people working in these fields. And you're going to hear from quite a lot of them this evening, so you're in for a real treat. Drug policy experts, scientists, psychologists, psychiatrists, and industry partners, of course, because we're not going to achieve any of this without the support of the industry. And of course, David Nutt. So our aims are education, so events like this, destigmatization, because psychedelics have probably had the worst stigma of any discipline, I would say, and through our outputs, our policy work, changing the law, as I said, really hinders research, and ultimately enabling patients to access a much needed medicine and kind of being ready for when the time comes, because medical cannabis was legalized, and it's been a real fight to enable patient access, which you will hear more about this evening. Okay, and I guess you're thinking, when will she stop talking? So good time to think about that now. 2 points. We need to be careful of this. We need to include the indigenous populations. These are plant medicines, folks, been in the Amazon for thousands of years. We need to respect that, and we need to involve indigenous, ethnic minorities in this, going forwards. We have to be very careful to keep people safe. It's a very vulnerable position to be in having a psychedelic experience. We need to be mindful of harm reduction and supporting people through their experiences and after the experience. And we need to think about the ethics, as I said, about, industry. We're all involved in this. We need to be very aware of the ethics around this, and giving back to where this came from and never forgetting that. One final thing, public opinion is shifting on this. We've done a YouGov survey recently, and the public are supportive of psychedelic assisted therapy, particularly for these hard to treat disorders, for the trauma associated with a terminal diagnosis. So really there's no excuse for government not to change the law to enable patient access. This is what people want, and it's what people need, and we're here to make sure that the evidence is provided for this. Okay, so there are of course loads of aspects of psychedelics, and we could talk about this forever. We can talk about the mechanism of action, the law, the history of psychedelic medicine is really, really interesting. But I think we're keen to answer your questions and to hear from you. You've all taken the trouble to come here, which is so lovely. But of course, you've come to hear from, the students and the people who are kind of entering this field. So I'm really delighted to introduce you to Anna Hogarth at this point in the proceedings. She is a final year medical student, and I'm kind of thinking lots of you are at university, you're neuroscience students, you're medical students, so it's a good opportunity to hear from Anna about how you can get more involved at your stage of your career. And, you're the future, folks. She established the Drug Science Student Society, and I hope you are all members of this or will be joining very soon, immediately after this. She has organised and chaired some amazing events for drug science, just brilliant, and she has a lot of expertise in psychedelics, and she also has experience as an actress, everybody. Amazing, fantastic, and has been in some music videos. So I'm going to hand you over to Anna now. Thank you, Anna.
Hi, thank you so much, Jo, and thank you everyone for having me here. It's so exciting to be here. Also very weird for me being on this kind of end of things. I don't normally do the talking, I just do the question asking, but I will do my very best. If I have connection problems, please let me know, because I've got not very good hotspot going on at the moment. But I'm just going to give you essentially a run through of how I ended up here, and then hopefully talk about how you can get involved. I'm not going to spend sort of too long on it, because I just kind of want to hear what your questions are and see if there's anything specifically that I can answer for you. So I actually started out as a neuroscience student at Bristol. I've always been very, very interested in understanding how the kind of mind and brain work, like I'm sure a lot of you are as well. And at Bristol, I wrote my dissertation on the sort of underlying mechanisms of ketamine as an antidepressant. And I think that was the first time that I really came across kind of how giant this unmet clinical need was, and how terrible some of the psychiatric drugs were for people. And also that, you know, there were a lot of good things that were available and could be being done, but they weren't, because of ridiculous kind of drug policies that were antiquated and entrenched in sort of racism and just very backwards and not evidence-based. Of course, at this point, I started reading some of David Nutt's books. That was a very big jumping off point for me. And while I was doing all this, I just thought that it would be amazing to get to be one of these doctors on these clinical trials. And so I decided to start again, essentially, after graduating, and go into undergraduate medicine. So I'm now finally in my final year, and I'm hoping to be a psychiatrist. That's where I'm hoping I'm heading. And while I was at medical school, I think it was at the end of my second year, I did an internship for a neuropharmaceutical company called Small Pharma, who are doing some amazing work at the moment, by the way, on DMT for depression. So I'd really recommend going and having a look at that. And they were just starting to do some work with the Drug Science Medical Cannabis Working Group. So through them, I got to produce some slides on medical cannabis for medical students, which was a great, and anyone who wants them, not just medical students. But it was a really great opportunity. They were an amazing company to work with. And of course, that put me in touch with drug science as well. And while I'd been at medical school with my sort of background in neuroscience and a reasonable amount of pharmacology, I just found it so ridiculous, the sort of teaching that we had on drugs, that I didn't think was particularly beneficial. There wasn't really enough about harm reduction. There wasn't anything about the new treatments. There was a reasonable amount of stuff of, you know, cannabis is bad, and that's the bottom line. So I started speaking to David Nutt, David Babcock, and James Bunn about setting up a society or helping to run some kind of student outreach. And that's essentially how I started the society. So it started at my university, which is Sparks in London. And slowly over the last few years, it's really been growing. So we've got lots of different universities that are in now, lots of people running their own societies, and it is so nice to be sort of part of this community of really like-minded students who are working so hard to put on just all kinds of different events. So it's, you know, things from drug policy to talk specifically about psychedelics to cannabis, and with the support of drug science, along with SSDP and the wonderful Southampton Psychedelic Society, we put on a conference at the beginning of, gosh, I think actually it was the beginning of this year, which seems like it should have been much longer ago. That's actually quite recently. And that was fantastic. It was 2 days of talks on psychedelics. And there is just so much room for people to be involved. We've got so many things that always need doing. So if anyone has any questions about that or any interest in getting involved, then please do reach out to us, because yeah, we're always looking for people to help and to volunteer. I think that's probably everything that I wanted to say. So if anyone has any questions, please let me know.
Sorry, I got carried away answering the questions.
Perhaps this is a good time for Q&A for this session. So we've got another about sort of 15, 20 minutes to answer anyone's questions that they might have. So if you want to put them in the Q&A box, I will read them out to Anna and Jo. So I guess I'll get started.
Can I say something as well? While you're give you a bit of breathing space to read the questions. I just want to say a really big thank you to Anna, because not only has she set up this organization, but she also drafted the first set, the slide set on psychedelics for drug science, and she's actually made a major contribution to the society and to the charity. So thank you very much, Anna.
Well, thank you. That's very nice. I mean, I'm glad to be here, so everybody wins.
Yeah, Anna's been an absolute star of drug science. We really appreciate all the good work, Anna, and Jo as well. I think it goes without saying. So there's a couple of questions that I think Jo, you've had a chance to answer in the chat. But what I would quite like to do is read a few of these back out to you, because then everyone can hear those answers. And the first one that comes in is, I think, a question for Jo. So how can you see the use of psychedelics being used to treat chronic illnesses, such as anything to do with chronic pain or IBS? And yeah, just sort of any ways for the community to get involved more with drug science, and the working group would be useful to know as well. But let's think that.
I mean, I suspect that'll be a slightly different paradigm, lower doses, but there was originally quite a lot of work done on LSD and chronic pain. Dave might want to jump in, because isn't there a trial starting at Imperial, Dave, on chronic pain? I think.
Yes, we've got some charitable funding to look at chronic pain, and we're in the process of developing the protocol, and we're hoping to start early in the new year. We haven't finally decided who's going to source from whom we're going to source the psilocybin at present. There's some discussions going on there, but yeah, we're likely to be doing a chronic pain study next year.
And there is some good evidence, Dave, isn't there, from the early work with LSD? There was some successful work on pain.
Well, I got interested in chronic pain, psychedelics in pain, from a patient of mine who about 8 years ago discovered I was working with psychedelics. I was treating him for another problem, but he always had a terrible limp, and he came and he said, "Look, I need to tell you about how I knew his limp was from a severe motorcycle accident when he was 16, and his leg never really healed. So he had this chronic neuropathic pain, and he said it destroyed me until I think about my 21st birthday. Then my 21st birthday, I went to a party and someone gave me a tab of LSD, and then for the first time I could walk without such destructive pain. I could actually dance." And he wrote me. I've got narratives. I'll actually have to put it in the public domain at some point, but it was a remarkable story. And I thought, well, hang on, how can we fit that into what we're understanding about the brain mechanisms of psychedelics? And we began to think about this whole way in which they might disrupt over-ingrained maladaptive circuits of activity behavior. And in fact, I even gave a talk to the work of physicians in which I talked about this, because I was asked to give a talk on approaches to pain. So and that was quite sympathetically received. The research now, because we've got the anecdotes.
Yeah. Well, but it is those, the patient stories and people telling you that I took that. So I was the cluster headache, I think, is really interesting. And I was talking to, actually, I forgot to say, folks, that I also work for Heroic Hearts UK, which is a combat veteran charity. And the CEO of that charity, the UK, he sits on our patient advocacy group, on the psychedelics working group. So I've got to know him, and he says a lot of combat veterans, of course, have some form of traumatic brain injury and have also very bad headaches. Maybe not quite cluster headaches, which are just sound horrendous, but he says that since he's been healed with ayahuasca, his headaches are not nearly as bad as they used to be. Dave, are there trials going on? I know there's quite a lot of personal stories
Yeah.
about cluster headache and people.
No, yeah. Well, there are. It's a complicated question because, of course, there is actually a non-psychedelic psychedelic called 6-bromo-LSD, which is actually quite effective in cluster headache, but has kind of has fallen foul of universities wanting to make a lot of money. So, though it's there have been trials ready to use it for about 10 years. No one, they haven't managed to extract it from Harvard. I think it's held, the IP is held between Harvard and Hanover universities, and they're both fighting over who should own it. So it's a classic example of universities getting in the way of research. I think it may have been released recently. I think I heard a rumor it might actually come into research. On the other side, there are companies looking at variants of DMT for cluster headache as well.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there are some that I don't know about who are going to be looking at low dose psilocybin too.
There is a lot going on in this space right now and all of that research. But what I would be quite keen to do is to answer another one of the Q&A questions, I guess. And I realized that because there's actually been so many that's been submitted, what we will try and do is in between sessions, we'll try and get a couple of the text responses back as well, so you can access those through the Q&A. But I think this would be a good question both for Anna and Jo to answer in a sense. Is a few people have been mentioning in the Q&A section about there seems to be a need to be in a healthcare or a medical space to be involved in what's happening in the psychedelic world. Do you think there are other degrees or career paths people can access this space from, other than just one based in medicine or healthcare?
I mean, definitely. I think James also being a prime example of that, being non-medical and doing just absolutely huge amounts. I think James did law and was a practicing lawyer for a bit, and is now doing just amazing work for drug science. I think also, there's just so many different ways that you can work with it. I mean, obviously, if you want to be doing the research, you may need to have, scientific or medical background, but there are other ways to be involved in study. I mean, drug science is a big organization. You've got people who do the communication, you've got people, I think someone was mentioning in the chat about whether they need to have like a graphic design ability to be able to produce posters, and that's actually there's just so many different ways. And there are companies as well now where they're sort of designing music specifically for psychedelic trips. And there's lots of different interesting stuff coming out in the tech industry to do with psychedelics. And yeah, I don't know what your thoughts are, Jo.
I would say exactly the same. Yeah, the tech industry is there's enormous potential there, isn't there? And that's come into psychiatry as well, hasn't it, Dave? People recording.
Yes, so yes, I mean, all patients are going to have Fitbits, etc., in the near future. Everything's to be downloaded. Make sure they go to bed at the right time at the very least.
Yeah, and recording their symptoms. I know Sean Lewis at Manchester.
Yes, of course, you can record. Yes,
developed some. Yeah. So, I think there's probably not a discipline that doesn't help. Too many negatives there, but I think most disciplines can get involved in this in one way or another. Criminology, of course, as well. Met some brilliant criminologists along the way. So,
and this might be a useful time to follow up with another one of the questions, actually specifically for you, Jo. Is sort of how did you make that transition from the pharmaceutical world to psychedelics? Was it something that became natural in the way you were working, or is it something that you had to actively pursue?
So I ran a very small company out of the university, and we preclinically, using animal models, tested whether new molecules were likely to work. It's very early stage, but we're maybe have the potential to be further investigated, put it that way. It was really all about whether they were likely to work and looking at the brain mechanisms and everything. So it's kind of a very natural segue to work on another medicine. How does it work in the brain? But I would say that sort of part of drug discovery, I think, it was very important for new chemical entities, because we had a lot to learn about kind of how they worked and what were they doing in the brain and in the animals, and that's time for another talk about how to do the animal work properly. You have to be a David Attenborough and all that. You really have to understand the species you're working with. But I think with psychedelics, there's so much human experience with psychedelics that the animal work, we don't need the animals to show that they're likely to work in depression or anxiety, or that's not where the animal and the early stage work is most, in my view, is so important. It's much more about the molecular mechanisms, what we sort of can't drill down to in all the human studies, all the imaging work that Dave and all the other experts have done. So that, to my mind, and then new, like anti-inflammatory mechanisms, TNF alpha, we can do all that in animals. And actually, Charles Flanagan has done some great work modelling asthma in animals, really exploring the anti-inflammatory effects. And there's some great work on the neuroplasticity. So what are the mechanisms of neuroplasticity, and what changes in the brain are you getting that may explain their enormous potential in people. But it's not the same paradigm, it's quite different. So I wouldn't be testing psilocybin in the animals in the same way. There's no point, because we know they work in people. It's not the same question as working with a new chemical entity, and that means they should get to people much, much quicker. But we need to change the law to let us get on with our job and let us do the trials and let us do the work. It's very frustrating as a scientist, but I can't imagine the frustration that Dave has, because running a clinical trial, it's, the impediment is enormous. And
absolutely, just massively increases the cost and adds actually no safety value at all. No, the whole thing is just so...
It's prohibitive. And what we find in our research is that there are loads of small institutions, people wanting to do this work, but they're not in a well-funded position to be able to do it, so they don't do it. So you're stopping a lot of research. It's really frustrating.
And talking about sort of drug discovery and research, I mean, two questions have come in for Anna, asking her about to sort of extrapolate a little bit on your role at Small Pharma.
Sure. So I worked there as an intern. I mean, actually not for very long. It was a very just fortuitous thing that it all kind of grew into drug science and things. But I was there, I was making this sort of slide deck on medical cannabis. So one on the history of the kind of politics and sort of natural history of cannabis, and one on sort of where we were at that point in time with kind of the legislation and where we saw treatments going. And I think what was particularly interesting about that is that I learned to use InDesign, which is an Adobe thing, very, very quickly. Obviously learned a huge amount about cannabis as well. But having that kind of skill set has now proven to be kind of endlessly useful for me, because being able to put together sort of posters or really, sort of professional looking things, I think as a student, if that's something that you can bring to the table, is really, really useful.
And can we just emphasize that all these slides are up on the Drug Science website? There's an amazing reservoir of information for those of you who want to learn and for those of you who want to teach.
Yeah, it's a dream come true, folks, because your slides are already prepared for you. I did a bit with the medical cannabis slides, and it's, it saves you days of work. It's great.
So we're running quite close to the wire, so I guess I'm going to ask maybe one, maybe two questions more, and as I say, hopefully Joe and Anna can stick around and answer a few via text after this. One of the questions that we got through actually, I think, is aimed at Joe, which is about, do you think there could be therapeutic potential for 5-MeO DMT? And has there been much research in this space around that?
Not everyone's different, so not everyone will respond to the same drugs. Not everyone will respond well to psilocybin or DMT. So maybe 5-MeO DMT, I met somebody who told me his trauma doesn't respond to anything but 5-MeO DMT. So that's a potential, isn't it? Dave, do you know why that might work as opposed to DMT? I don't, to be honest.
one of the, we've talked about the problems of doing research, which is enormous, but one forgotten aspect of those problems is that we know almost nothing about the pharmacokinetics of these compounds. We know the subjective time course, but there's only in the last year has anyone really done any systematic work to try to look at whether different genotypes of cytochromes affect the speed of metabolism, etc. And that's so far really just for LSD, and there's a little bit for psilocybin. And it's very clear from, there's huge individual variation, and that might be at the level of genetics of receptors or genetics of enzymes. And I'm going to have to let you answer the rest of that because I'm being requested to do something.
Not walk the dogs, I hope.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And sorry, James, I would just say that ADME, the absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion, all that work, really, we need to do all that work with all the psychedelics, and we need to, pharmacogenetics, it's going to be very important, who metabolizes these fast and slow, and the enzymes, that work all needs to be done. That's going to be. And
the variation's enormous. In our LSD study, we gave the drug intravenously to make sure everyone got it. And 2 people had no response at all. And I have zero idea why that was. It clearly
rapid
went
metabolizers.
A lot more research is being done in this space, obviously. We're about to move on to the next session, but just before we do, I think it'd be useful for me to address a question that's come up a few times, which may come up in the later parts of this recording as well. And that's about the recent news about the rescheduling potentially coming from number 10. So what's happened there at the moment is that, to give a little bit of clarity and light on it, is Boris Johnson back in May was given a report to sign off on, which is around the Home Office rescheduling psilocybin and a few other compounds from Schedule 1. He sent that through to the Home Office with instruction to reschedule, or with instruction that they should at least consider this, and he's signed off on it and given his approval to do so. So that's been sitting with the Home Office since late May, and the deadline for which that decision should have been made was very recently, which is why now it's become public news. So that's the update at the moment. We don't know any more other than that, but we will be keeping a tight stranglehold on it, hoping to hear a little bit more soon. And as soon as we do, we'll make sure to let everyone that's sort of following us on social media to know. So thank you very much, Joe, and thank you very much, Anna. I'm actually going to be slightly disappearing now and handing over to the professional here of hosting, which is Miss Anna Hogarth, and moving over to our medical cannabis panel. But thank you very much, Joe.
Thank you. Great to be here.
I'm getting my job back. It's very exciting. Great. Okay. So we're going to be moving on to the medical cannabis section. Just for any of those, I can just see there's a few questions about setting up a society and whether there's pushback and that kind of thing. If you maybe tweet at the Drug Science Student Society or at me, I will try and answer some of those questions or type them in the box. But I think for time and to get on to this next very exciting bit, we should probably move on. So this section is going to be on the medicalisation of cannabis. We'll be hearing from the wonderful Professor Mike Barnes, who will be telling us all about his work and advocacy in medical cannabis. He's the consultant neurologist and has been advocating for patient access to cannabis for, I think, nearly 2 decades now. And we will also then be hearing from Ryan Zafar, who's a PhD student at Imperial, who's worked quite closely with David Nutt and has been doing some amazing stuff on medical cannabis for epilepsy. And then we'll be hearing from the lovely Mags Houston, who is helping to run, is a communications officer for Project 2021, which is the what I should have said right at the beginning, fantastic project that Drug Science is doing, as I'm sure you all know, and actually Professor Mike Barnes is leading, but Mags is doing all the communication stuff for that and has been doing really great work on setting up a student campaign, which I think lots of people will be keen to get involved in. So I will hand over then to Professor Mike Barnes, please.
Thank you, and good evening to everybody. It's lovely to talk to you all. Although I can't, it's one of these things about weird things to Zoom. You sort of talk to yourself on a screen and you don't realize there's 325 people sat behind it. So I'm going to try and do the impossible, which is sort of give a quick overview of cannabis, because I'm sure some of you know a lot about it and some of you might know less about it, for something like 25 minutes. And then, where we go, I'll shut my phone off silent before it keeps pinging at me. Then I'm going to pass over to Ryan for about 10 minutes to tell us a little bit about some early results coming from the T21 program, which of course we'll explain as we go along. Regard to epilepsy, I think, Ryan, you're going to talk about that. And then going to pass over to Mags, who, and I kindly said I run the program. I don't really, it's Mags that runs the program and organizes everything, and tell us a little bit more about the detail of T21 and how you can be involved in it. So that's my introduction. I'm a neurologist. Some would say I'm not really a neurologist. I'm more of a cannabis physician these days, but I was a neurologist, mainly working in the field of brain injury, and worked with the early first cannabis licensed medicine called Psychedelics, which is still around for multiple sclerosis spasticity, about 20 years ago now, I think 18, 19, 20 years ago, something like that. So I'm going to put some slides on the screen, if I may. Can I share the screen okay, Anna? Is that all right? Yep.
Yeah,
do that. That's lovely. There we go. So I'll just put this on slideshow from beginning, and hopefully you'll just give me a nod that you can see that. Yep, great. So I'm going to zoom through this in about 25 minutes. It's a sort of very high level view. It's a sort of a high level drone view of cannabis, all the aspects. I'm going to try the impossible in 25 minutes to cover it. But maybe, hopefully, for those who don't know that much about it, will give you an idea of the wonderful value of the plant. So let's very briefly, all these sections are going to be very brief, but let's have a quick look at the history, because the plant is not really widely known. And from some of the newspaper reporting, you think it's a brand new medicine, and we don't know enough about it. It's actually the first written description of a medicine known to man. And it was described by this guy, Emperor Shen Nung, about 5,000 years ago. So that's extraordinary, really, that it's been around for that length of time. He described it really for pain, possibly for epilepsy, though the description is a bit lost in translation, as it were. But certainly it was well described. It then spread generally westwards along the Silk Road into ancient India, into the ancient Egypt, Greece, into the Middle East and Europe, and then 44, 500 years ago spread across the Atlantic to North and South America. So it's got a very long and distinguished history, not just as a recreational product, of course, not just as a spiritual product, which it still is, but mainly and for a medical product, and it's still the medical use we're discussing today. And I'm jumping millennia, let alone centuries, and it was just a totally accepted part of medicine up to about the 1930s, when modern pharmaceutical medicine became predominant. And of course, this is not an anti-pharmaceutical talk at all. Pharmaceutical medicine has done wonders for modern health, but we shouldn't forget that modern medicine is largely based on plants, and it was up to the 1930s or so, medicine was plant medicine. So it shouldn't be surprised that the cannabis was simply part of the armory of a doctor, certainly in the 19th and early 20th century. And this is the founder, the father, so-called, of modern medicine, William Osler, who was a proponent and a supporter of the use of cannabis. In his case, he suggested its use for migraine. It said, I'd love this slide, it's probably not true, but we'll put it up and assume it is. It was used by Queen Victoria for period pains, and certainly her physician, Sir John Russell Reynolds, was also a supporter of the use of cannabis, again, particularly for pain. Then if this was a pantomime, we're not really near Christmas yet, but you should be booing at this stage, because this was the guy who's responsible really for the, if you like, the demonization of cannabis, Harry Anslinger. It's an interesting, true story, which I could just summarize in 30 seconds. He was the first commissioner of the FBN, as opposed to the FBI. He was running the prohibition campaign. That campaign was finishing. His influence and his budget and his manpower was going down. So he thought, and a good politician that he no doubt was, he thought, I need another campaign to keep my influence up there. And he alighted on cannabis, which he rechristened marijuana, which is the Mexican word. It's a very nasty, unpleasant, racist and anti-black, anti-Mexican campaign, supported by some of the newspapers of the day. And I'm sure you've all seen or heard of Reefer Madness. That's a sort of classic film of the era, still available on YouTube if anyone would like to see it and waste half an hour of their lives. It's actually so appalling, it's actually entertaining. And that sort of campaign was really responsible for the global demonization, I think is the right word, of cannabis for no scientific basis whatsoever, I have to say. And that, jumping again several decades this time to 1961, all that campaign resulted in the UN Single Convention on Drugs of 1961, where cannabis was placed in Schedule 4, Schedule 1, same category as morphine, heroin, cocaine, synthetic opioids, more restrictive actually than coca and opium. It was liable to abuse and produced ill effects, and such liability is not by substantial therapeutic advantage. So basically they said it's nothing but useless and there's no therapy in it, which isn't clearly true. That in turn led every country who was a signatory, which was all but 4 countries in the world, to the Misuse of Drugs Act in 1971. And then that was sort of put into stone by the Misuse of Drugs regulations in Schedule 1, which again, by definition, means that cannabis has no therapeutic value, contrary to 5,000 years of therapeutic history. And it was only changed in November 2018, so very recently, where for certain circumstances, cannabis is moved into Schedule 2, which means it can be prescribed by doctors on the specialist register. I'll come back to that point in a moment. So that's where we are today. It's still a Class B drug. There's still significant penalties for possession, and certainly for possession with intent to supply, but just in certain circumstances, it can be prescribed. I was speaking to a policeman in the Sussex force this morning, and he said, a lovely man, and he'd looked into it. He said, really no one in the police force knows the law's been changed, which astonishes me, but nevertheless, he said it's true, and I'm going to hopefully speak to some people at Scotland Yard when they meet for their registration officers in the coming weeks to enlighten them of that fact, because they're still taking cannabis away from those who are now legally entitled to hold it. So let's, this audience, I'm sure, is very knowledgeable about the endocannabinoid system. I wasn't when I was a student, mainly because I'm so old that it wasn't invented then. If invented is the wrong word, discovered is perhaps the better word. So I'm not going to dwell on this slide. I'm assuming most of you understand it, but maybe I'm wrong. But this is the presynaptic nerve at the top, linking to the postsynaptic nerve. As you recall or know, they don't physically touch. There's a gap in between called the synaptic cleft. And the electrical signal is transmitted across that gap by various neurotransmitters, which we all know about, like glutamate and GABA on this slide, like dopamine, like serotonin, etc. When that, go backwards. When that neurotransmitter hits the postsynaptic neuron, inrush of calcium to trigger the signal in the postsynaptic neuron and carry on down the chain to the end motor point. That influx of calcium triggers the production of the endocannabinoids called anandamide and 2-AG are the two main ones. They are made on demand. They go backwards across the synaptic cleft to link with cannabinoid receptors on the presynaptic neuron. And that linkage induces an influx of calcium on that side of the membrane and switches off, basically, the neurotransmission. So if you like, it's a negative feedback loop. It's a controller, a homeostatic mechanism. It just calms down the neurotransmission. And that's prevalent in all nerves. It's the most prevalent neurotransmitter system in the body. It's all over the body. Everywhere there's a nerve, there's an endocannabinoid system. That's true, not just in man, but in all vertebrates. Now that's all very exciting. So they're the endocannabinoids. The endocannabinoid system, what it does, just a snapshot of things it can do. It has a role in memory. It has a role in appetite. It's very strongly anti-inflammatory. It's very strongly analgesic. It regulates temperature. It promotes sleep. It has a role in motor control of spasticity, a role in neurogenesis and neuroplasticity, reduces bladder tone, reduces motility in the GI tract, for example, for Crohn's disease. There's a role in embryonic implantation and control of some cancer responses, anti-cancer, if you like. And that's why some people use all these uses against cannabis. They, well, it must be some sort of snake oil. It can't possibly do all those things. That's because our mindset is focused on pharmaceutical products, which generally do one thing. An antihypertensive reduces blood pressure. An antidiabetic controls blood sugar. An antibiotic controls bacteria. But the endocannabinoid system has such a wide range of role. And when you realize that the phytocannabinoids in the plant work through the endocannabinoid system largely, not exclusively, but largely, it can have such a broad range of effect, cannabis itself, from analgesia to epilepsy to some role in cancers yet not totally worked out, to inflammatory bowel disease, etc., etc. So that's how it works, or the phytocannabinoids work. And the phytocannabinoids, of course, are found in the plant, and they're mainly found in the unfertilized female flower. That's the main source of cannabinoids, unfertilized female flowers. The males are only useful really for fertilizing the female. And then you need, if you're growing this in your loft or whether you care to grow it, you need to get rid of the male plants, because if the male plants fertilize the female plants, the yield of cannabinoids goes right down. So the males are only useful, only function for fertilization. Some in the audience may agree with that in the human paradigm, but they're not useful in cannabis cultivation. And the mature plant is, of course, can be a medical end product, because 60% of prescriptions in this country at the moment are for dried flower. And the dried flower, you can see the value is because if you look at those white dots on the right-hand side, they're the trichomes. And in those trichomes live the phytocannabinoids. There's a blown up example of them. So in that bobble at the top there, the glandular trichome, that's where all the phytocannabinoids reside. So the dried flower can have a very useful medical effect, because if you smoke it, or that's not legal, but vape it, which is legal, then you get an immediate response. Within seconds, you'll get a response if you vape it, and that's very useful for breakthrough pain, for example. But we also want to extract the oil from those trichomes, and it's oil that has 40% of prescriptions at the moment in the UK, and the oil has a longer effect, a little bit quickly if it's under the tongue, a little bit slower if you swallow it, but the oil has a sort of background effect, and the plant for vaping has a more immediate effect. So the medical effects are largely modulated through the phytocannabinoids found mainly in the flower, to a lesser extent in the leaves. Now, there's 147, I think, is the latest count of phytocannabinoids. So you're familiar, I'm sure, with 2, but there's 145 others. 12 of those are controlled. That means they're largely those that have psychoactivity. Now, I think that's the wrong term. I'm sure there's experts of drug science who we can argue about this or discuss this forever. What I mean by that is it gets you high. Intoxicating is not quite the right word. Psychoactive is not quite the right word. And the one we've all heard of is delta-9 THC, which works through the endocannabinoid system. It's a partial agonist of the cannabinoid receptors. It also has other slightly broader roles. And THC, just in isolation, not with the rest of the plant, all by itself, is analgesic, it's antioxidant, it relaxes muscles, it's anti-sick, and it's anti-inflammatory, very strongly anti-inflammatory. So you can see just THC has very useful potential medical properties. All the other cannabinoids, 135 of them, are non-psychoactive, they don't get you high. And the one we've all heard of is cannabidiol, CBD. That's all in the shelves of Boots and Holland & Barrett these days. That is actually a CB1 antagonist and an inverse agonist of CB2. It counteracts the high of THC. That's important to remember for medical use. It counteracts the high. It doesn't work only through the endocannabinoid system. Just other points on that slide indicate it does have actions through the other parts of the neural system. And cannabidiol, CBD, by itself also has excellent medical properties. It's neuroprotective, it's anti-anxiety, it's anticonvulsant. This, of course, is the main thing that the children with epilepsy changed the law benefit from. It's cytotoxic in some types of breast cancer, and is anti-emetic as well. So you can see their isolation. But let's not forget there's more to the plant than just THC and CBD. It's not that simple. And I haven't got time to go into the whole of the cannabinoid pathways, but the mother cannabinoid is CBG, cannabigerol. It comes in acidic form, hence the A after it, in the natural plant, which is not psychoactive. That CBG is broken down into THC and CBD, and another one called CBC. And those are studied, and not all by any means have been studied in any detail. But let's look at one of them. Let's look at CBG, which is a little bit more studied than some of the others. And that's anti-cancer, it's anti-inflammatory, reduces bladder tone, it reduces intraocular pressure, therefore used in glaucoma. It's antibacterial, interestingly, and it's a stimulant of appetite. That's just one of them. If you multiply all those medical properties that we know about by the number of cannabinoids in the plant, and you add to that the terpenes in the plant, which give it its characteristic smell, there's about 100 of those, and the flavonoids in the plant, which give it its characteristic color, all of those have some medical properties that we are so far tested. You can imagine there's a huge complexity to the cannabis plant, thousands and thousands of different combinations of these cannabinoids, terpenes, and flavonoids to give a really interesting range of medical uses, really. These are just a list of those that most of those we haven't really covered at all, frankly. So there's a long, long way to go in terms of cannabinoid medicine and science behind it. Here's some of the terpenes I mentioned earlier. But the point is, each cannabis cultivar has a unique cannabinoid and terpene profile, and therefore each one has a unique biological activity. There's not one plant, it's not just cannabis as one medicine. Get out of your mind the pharmaceutical paradigm of one medicine, one molecule. It's a whole family of medicines. And the interesting and fascinating thing is, there's not scientifically any doubt anymore, the whole plant works better than individual components of the plant. And that's because of all those cannabinoids working probably synergistically. So the whole plant of the cannabinoids, terpenes, and other compounds consumed together have a better effect, that so-called entourage effect. And we know that the full spectrum cannabis oils that we can prescribe now, that means everything in the plant, the terpenes and cannabinoids, that particular cultivar, have a better effect than the individual components. That's an important point to remember when we're looking to prescribe it. I'm not going to do this because it's a whole talk in its own right, but we now know beyond any doubt about the usefulness of cannabis for 5 main indications. Pain is one, and that's most of the prescriptions. About 60% of prescriptions are for pain, chronic pain, that is, chronic pain, not particularly acute pain. Quite a lot of good evidence for that. A lot of it real world evidence as opposed to double-blind, placebo-controlled pharmaceutical type evidence. I accept that, but that's what we need to accept for this plant, which doesn't lend itself to double-blind, placebo-controlled studies. Number 2 is plasticity. We know that from Sativex that I mentioned right at the beginning. Number 3 is anxiety, a very good effect for anxiety, mainly CBD, but often you need a little bit of THC to add to that benefit. Nausea and sickness, in the context of chemotherapy, excellent evidence, 23 controlled trials, even Cochrane Review confirmed that. And finally, for the really good evidence, epilepsy. We know that, particularly from Epidiolex, which is nearly, but not quite, a CBD isolate, but you get a much better effect in epilepsy from the full spectrum product. Ryan's going to talk about some of the results we found in the early studies. Other things can be useful for with slightly less robust evidence, but still good evidence, like Tourette's. For example, emerging evidence for autism, ADHD, some aspects of Parkinson's disease. The list goes on. But those 5 things are the main current mainstay of good evidence behind this. Now, any medicine, you've got to look at the side effects or the long-term effects as well as the benefits. But fortunately, cannabis has very few significant long-term or certainly short-term side effects. Sure, the more THC in the plant, the more side effects. That's no doubt. CBD, I can't say CBD is totally safe, because it isn't, but it's pretty safe. THC, more side effects than CBD. Bit of overlap, 4 Ds, dizziness, drowsiness, dry mouth, and in THC terms, disorientation. Usually well tolerated, usually not an issue, unless you have very high THC without CBD cover, like you can get in some of this high THC street cannabis, so-called skunk, which is the wrong word, but that's the sort of press use of the word. Sure, it's not right for everybody. Let me absolutely clear, it's not a cure-all, it's not right for everybody. If you've got a history of psychosis in yourself or first-degree relative in the recent past, I wouldn't prescribe it. If you came along with 50 with back pain and had an psychotic episode when you're 16, yes, I would prescribe it probably. So it's not, there's nothing that's absolute. I wouldn't prescribe, I'd be cautious about prescribing in mania for cannabis use disorder. If just THC, you might use CBD in that case. And like anything else, you wouldn't use it in pregnancy or breastfeeding. THC gives you a tachycardia, so you'll be cautious with any condition that has an increased heart rate is not good for you, like post-MI and post-stroke. But pretty safe. Most people, I would say 90% plus of the population would be perfectly okay to use cannabis, really very safely compared to many of the pharmaceutical medicines. So where are we now? I'm just going to move now to the more of the politics and where we are. We've had 3 NHS prescriptions in 3 years, and that's pretty poor. And they're just for the 3 children with serious epilepsy, but there's been very high profile in the press. We've had nevertheless 10,000 patients prescribed privately, and that's sad, because a lot of people can't afford it privately. Now there's a plethora of clinics, about 15, actually, I think it's 16 now, private clinics. I've trained about 200 doctors. I don't have to be the trainer of the doctors, but I have trained about 200 doctors. About 70 are prescribing. There's a good range of products in the country from about 16 producers, all imported, which is another poor issue, gives supply chain problems. As I said already, 60% flour prescription, 40% oil. Average cost is not insignificant. There's not that many people in this country that can afford about £300 a month, except if you're on the T21 program, when it's about half that price, which, okay, it's still a lot for people, but it's much more, clearly much more affordable. So it can be prescribed now for any condition, not those 5 I mentioned, any condition that the doctor feels is in the best interest of the patient. Only by a doctor on the specialist register to initiate that prescription, but GPs or pharmacists actually can continue that prescription under their direction. But the vast majority of doctors won't prescribe. Why is that? Because they're ignorant. Yes, it's not taught in medical schools. There's a lot of ignorance, there's a lot of stigma around it still, and some of the hierarchy medical bodies like the British Pediatric Neurology Association, for example, even the Royal College of Physicians, even NICE, have looked at this from the wrong paradigm, and they don't really understand the nuances of the plant. So we've got to have teaching. That's absolutely essential. That's why I'm so pleased to do things like tonight. Some would say it's a lack of evidence, but that's lack of evidence from a pharmaceutical standpoint and not lack of evidence from a real world standpoint. There's an overwhelming amount of real world evidence. Okay, we need more evidence. Of course, we'll always need more evidence, 147 cannabinoids to learn about. But my view is people with chronic long-term conditions, why deny them chronic pain when there's nothing else to treat them? Chronic epilepsy, there's nothing else to treat them. Let's use cannabis, which is useful for many, safe, and let's learn as we go along, would be my view. There's poor guidelines. We can, the next slide will correct that, from NICE, from the British Pediatric Neurology Group, from the Royal College of Physicians, then very poor guidelines that don't really understand the nuances of the plant at all. So I'm going to put a quick advert in here for anyone who's a clinician amongst you to join the Medical Cannabis Clinician Society, where we have a lot of interesting documents like Prescriber's Guide, CBD, frequent asked questions, a formulary, peer support, which works really well, I have to say. So put in a quick plea to join that, and we're very much in partnership with Drug Science. We do joint teaching, like I'm doing one tomorrow, for example. So finally, the T21 program, before I shut up, this is absolutely excellent program. It's really worthwhile. It's basically a registry aimed to monitor the health outcomes of, hence the name, 20,000 patients, or be by the end of 2021. I don't think we'll get to that target, but maybe we will by the end of 2022. So it's a stand back observational study, and it's really already producing a wonderful amount of evidence of the efficacy and safety of cannabis. You can join the program if you have one of these 7 conditions, which I'll let you read briefly, but they're those main things I mentioned earlier, plus some others like Tourette's and post-traumatic stress disorder, for example. The good thing, there's plenty of products available. It's a limited formulary in terms of what is available nationally, but there's plenty of products to choose from. The good thing for the patient is the price is capped, broadly speaking, £150 per prescription, which is per month. I won't bore you with the other nuances of the costs, but it's basically half price. And in return, the patient has to fill in a basic, fairly easy to complete questionnaire, a baseline, and every 3 months. And that's all they have to do in exchange for that cheaper availability of product. And let me just finally, before I shut up, let's have a look at some of the 3 months data that was presented only this week by Michael Linsky, who's the data analyst. They've looked so far, we've got about 1,700 patients on the study so far. At 3 months follow-up, there's 466 that were analyzed by the end of August. And look at that improvement in self-reported health from a mean of 47 to 61. The higher the score, the healthier you perceive yourself. And that's highly statistically significant with a Cohen's D, that's an effect size estimate of 0.68, which is really remarkably large. That's accepted to be an indicator of a large effect size. And by comparison, the effect size of antidepressants for depression, I'm told, is about 0.33. So it puts it into context. Let's look at finally some other of these parameters. I won't dwell on these in detail because time's against me, but look at those. They're all good effect size. Anything more than 0.2 is a small but good effect size. Moving up, the higher you go, the more effect size there is. Look at usual activities there, 1.25, it's really high. Anxiety and depression, effect size of 0.56. Pain, a really remarkable improvement. The total score over all of these is, again, a remarkable improvement on the visual analog scale of quality of life. Again, we mentioned earlier, is 0.68. So all those things, and that's perhaps looking at pain. Remember that cannabis doesn't just treat pain or anxiety, it treats the quality of life. So it helps sleep, it helps appetite, if it helps anxiety, if you've got, which reduces pain, for example, and vice versa. And finally, look at the sleep scale, improving sleep, a really significant effect size on improving sleep and indeed improving depression using the PHQ-9 with a really remarkably strong effect size. So these are very, very early results. Ryan is now going to tell us a little bit about the epilepsy results. More results will come out with more robust numbers. We'll look at the 6 months, 9 months, 12 months data over the course of the next year or more. And I'm sure, and I hope we will see similar really impressive results emerging from the T21 study, which is absolutely great project. If anyone wants to ask me questions directly, that's my email. If you want to quickly note that down, and at that point I should stop talking. I think I've been speaking 25 minutes and pass to Ryan, who's going to tell us for 10 minutes about the epilepsy results that we've looked at in a related study. So I will stop sharing my slide and pass to you, Ryan.
Cool, thank you very much for that, Mike. I'm just sharing my slides at the moment. I was just wondering if everyone can see that or
not yet.
No. Okay, let me just try again. Now?
There you go. Yes, they're there now, right?
Okay. And can you see that in the normal view or the presenter view?
That's fine as it is. It's on the left-hand side of the screen. That's good.
We have got presenter view, but
it is in presenter view. Sorry. Okay, I'll just play it in normal view then. Okay, great. So yeah, I'm Ryan. As Mike said, I'm a PhD student working with Professor David Nutt and Dr. David Arizzo in the Psychedelic Research Group and Neuropsychopharmacology Unit at Imperial College. So over there, I do a lot of brain imaging in addiction and psychedelics, but for drug science specifically, for the last 2 years, I've been working with Professor Nutt and Anne Schlag in the field of epilepsy. So the epilepsy story really started several years ago with the case of Alfie Dingley, who was a boy who had a chromosomal genetic defect. Him and only one other individual in the world had this. And for that, he needed to have a lot of intravenous steroids. And if he was to upkeep that treatment, it would eventually kill him. His family decided to move to the Netherlands in 2017, where they started giving him medicinal cannabis, and they saw a dramatic effect. With full extract CBD, he was managed to reduce his seizures, and then when adding THC, he was able to go seizure-free. So since that, his mother, Hannah Deacon, has been a campaigner who's been publicised very heavily in British media and globally. And in 2018, on the 7th of November, almost 3 years ago, Alfie was the recipient of the first medical cannabis prescription, which was made by Professor Mike Barnes, who you just heard from before. So although Alfie is one of the lucky ones and one of the 3 lucky ones who do have an NHS prescription for medical cannabis, there's a host of other children in the UK that do not have this. And so Hannah, alongside other parents, formed a group called End Our Pain and MedCan Support. And this group essentially joined together to pressure and lobby the government and other individuals in order to try to get this medicine for their children on the NHS. So medical cannabis since the 1800s have been found to have anticonvulsant properties, and an Irish doctor, William O'Shaughnessy, actually went to India and wrote about this in a medical journal presented at the Royal Society. And modern science has allowed us to investigate the relative anticonvulsant effects of 2 of the major cannabinoids. So THC works at the CB1 receptor, and as Mike mentioned, it's responsible for the stoning effects from cannabis, but also we know that now it actually reduces the amount of pro-inflammatory cytokines in the body, which is possibly one way that it can cause the brain to overexcite, leading to seizure generation. And also we know that it perhaps could also increase the number of anti-inflammatory cytokines, which basically cool down the brain and could also reduce seizures. And then we have CBD as well, which acts on several receptors, which don't really work at the CB1 receptors. So we've got the GPR55, we've also got some cation channels and serotonin receptors. And in synergy, we don't know the exact mechanism yet, this is working together to calm down an overactive neural circuit that leads to seizures. So what we wanted to do is gather the data from the children in the UK that were using whole plant medical cannabis to treat their epilepsies. And so we recruited patients from the charity End Our Pain and Medcan database. And we conducted phone telephone screenings with the patients and the carers, with the carers of the patients, because they were all children, to collect some valuable data, specifically on what drugs they were using, the numbers of seizures they were having, both pre and post cannabis, also the financial parameters associated with in terms of cost for private prescriptions. And then also, as well as that, we were interested in really learning about the CBD dose, the THC dose, just to get an overall picture of the kind of ranges of dose for medication that they were using that seemed to be effective. And then we applied some fancy statistical analysis onto this, which I'll go on to explain a little bit later on. And then as well as this, we thought, as well as a pharmacological story, we wanted to really understand the stories of these families, and we conducted a narrative research review, which really allowed the parents of these patients to tell their stories and identify barriers to entry in their plight to get medical cannabis for their children. So here are the results, which are quite outstanding. So we had 21 children, and if you see the blue arrows over there, 3 of the children in our cohort managed to get complete remission of their seizures from medical cannabis. If you look at the x-axis over here, it's called a log scale, which means it increases tenfold each time. And so you can see some of these children were having over 10,000 seizures a day, which is astronomical, especially this patient number 8 and patient number 9 going down to 0. So you can really see the true value of this medicine. And then as well as this, we saw that overall across cohort, there was an 84% reduction in seizure frequency, which represents 30 to 50-fold decrease. And when you compare that to other anti-epileptic drugs that are available on the market at the moment, none of these have gone above a 50% reduction in seizure frequency following treatment, which really shows the outstanding impact of medical cannabis in this group. And then cannabidiol, which is the licensed medicine for these children, only manages to achieve in the clinical trials around 50%. Although we can't compare observational research directly with RCTs like this, we can say that we do have a superior effect, at least to some extent. And I'm sure that if controlled research was done, we'd also replicate those findings. So this is some of the EEG recordings of some of the patients. So one of the patients in our study, when using Epidiolex, you can see a lot of activity, which isn't very synchronized, which is kind of testament to epileptic activity in the brain. And then when you see after 3 months of whole medical cannabis, this child that was involved has a lot more synchrony in their brain activity. And this basically shows that it's working on a neural level to restore some of those circuits that I mentioned before. So the Bayesian analysis is essentially a statistical model that we can apply to the data, which allows us to see whether the next patient that would take it would have a successful treatment response. And what we did was, using some complicated maths over here, is that we had 21 statistically significant trials and 0 failures. So essentially what that translates to is a 96% chance that any other patient with a similar intractable treatment-resistant epilepsy that will take whole plant medical cannabis will have the same results as the patients that we see in our cohort, which is obviously great to hear. And as Mike mentioned before, the cost of this is a lot more than what it is for adults. The average cost for the children in our first cohort was £1,700 a month, whereas on the black market, it's around £3,700 a year. So you can see why patients and families would rather go to that. In the Netherlands, it's only £7,000 a year per patient. And when you contrast that to the cost of pediatric ICU, which a lot of these children have to go to, being over £5,000 a day, you can see that there's really a cost argument for integrating this into the NHS. And that's something that we'll be working on doing at some point this year. So these were two of the main publications that we got from that. So the original one about the 10 patients and the qualitative assessment that you can read in your own time if you're interested. And then I'm just going to go quickly onto two more papers. So just building a little bit onto medical cannabis research. Since the ban in 1972, there was a dearth of research in the field. But then in the 2000s, we've had a massive increase in the number of clinical trials. And if you want to go and look into this paper in more detail, we kind of combined RCT evidence as well as patient-reported outcomes and real-world evidence. And essentially, we've grouped all of these different disorders into what we think the strength of evidence is versus the relative number of patients. And again, with cannabis medicines coming to market and cannabis obviously having dependence issues, it's critical that doctors and clinicians are aware when they're prescribing medicines to not have their patients end up developing dependence-like issues. And in this paper, we looked at all of these factors and had 7 recommendations for clinicians on how to minimize risks of dependence. So again, if you're interested in that, then the link for the paper is there. So finally, what's next for these children? So Chris Whitty, the chief medical officer, came out a few years ago and said that we need to avoid another thalidomide tragedy. And so he's opposed to the idea of necessarily giving whole plant medicines to these children without RCTs. However, we argue that RCTs in these kids would be immoral due to the fact that if you withdraw a medicine from them that's working, it can lead to them having a worse outcome. There's also some resistance from groups that are basically control to some extent pediatric neurologists' ability to prescribe. So the BPNA is one example of this, and we need to try to convince these doctors of the efficacy that we see in our studies. And there's a lot of fear around it related to psychosis, related to toxicology, but cannabis has been used for millennia in medicine, and there's been no reported fetal harms. And finally, RCTs are not the only way to gather evidence. And the ex-head of the MHRA said this in his Hervian lecture in 2008. RCTs are expensive and they're not necessarily there to show effectiveness. They show efficacy, which are two separate things and don't really translate to the real world. Again, if you want to look into some of these barriers, Dave Nutt has done several articles on this in the BMJ. So thank you very much for listening, and happy to take any questions at the end. And if you'd want to get into contact with me for anything, then my email and Twitter is there. Thank you. And I think now I'll hand over to Mags, who will speak a bit about T21.
Thanks so much, Ryan. Yes, so I'm going to talk a bit about Project 2021. I'm going to try and keep it rather speedy because I'm conscious that we are overrunning ever so slightly. So I'm going to just share my screen there. Can I just ask, is that sharing presenter mode or the other mode?
So that's presenter mode that I think you're sharing.
All right, a second. Let's try again. Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to do a full screen, I think, here instead, just to avoid taking up more time. Okay, so I've been at Drug Science, just to kind of briefly say who I am. So I've been at Drug Science for about a year now. I head up Project 2021, which, as Mike says, is our observational medical cannabis study. We've currently got about 1,700 patients registered with the study. So I want to talk about our student campaign that we launched a couple of months ago, but it's really come to fruition over Freshers Week. And I want to just start by saying kind of why, who we're talking to with the student campaign and why. So first off, we really wanted to try and connect with potential patients. So that could be anyone, including students aged 18 or over. And secondly, we want to just raise awareness with the general public. So all students, all of you guys could really, really help us raise awareness around not only medical cannabis and the general state of its legal state in the UK, but also about Project 2021 as well. And finally, we really want to speak to future doctors. So many of you guys in the audience today will be medic students or future scientists, people who can really make a difference in this field. And as we've already mentioned, there are some amazing resources online on the Drug Science website, including our medical cannabis educational slides. So who can join Project 2021? Well, you would need to have a confirmed diagnosis of one of these 8 conditions that you see on the screen now. So the most common ones at the moment are chronic pain and anxiety. And we're really excited that we've actually just launched ADHD this month as well. So we'll be taking on new patients now with a primary condition of ADHD. And the second piece of criteria in order to join the project is you need to have tried 2 licensed medications before, and that this information is then given through to your clinic from your doctor to confirm all these before you're actually allowed to join the project. So why should students want to join T21 as a patient? Well, as part of this campaign, I spoke to our clinics, and we've got 3 clinics currently offering a £20 discount off of the initial consultation. Because this all happened within kind of private prescribing rather than NHS at the moment, what this means is that the consultation costs do need to be paid for by patients. So we're always looking to try and bring these costs down as much as we can. But as drug science, because we're observational here, we're quite limited in what we can do from a consultation cost point of view. But I was really pleased to be able to get at least something for the students out there. Where we really can make a difference from a cost point of view as drug science is we have created this project to be able to cap the price of medical cannabis. As we've just seen from Mike and from Ryan's presentations, the cost of medical cannabis is still so huge when it comes to private prescriptions. So that's really one of the key things that Project 2021 has enabled, is it's brought down the cost of the prescriptions for patients. It's still not as low as we'd love it to be. And ultimately, we want to open up access on the NHS, of course. That's really why we're collecting all this data, but at least we're able to reduce the cost for patients in the meantime. So as being part of the project, you are contributing to that evidence pool, which really, really needs, we really need as much evidence as we can, especially coming out of the UK, in order to give doctors more confidence to prescribe medical cannabis and give them the tools that they need to ultimately open up that NHS access for patients. So what do we do as part of this student campaign? Well, this was kind of my strategy, really, in a nutshell. First off, I reached out to lots of pastoral wellbeing teams at universities back in around June, which didn't work. I didn't hear back from hardly any of them. Perhaps they were on their summer holidays, perhaps they see the word cannabis and run a mile, who knows? But I wanted to do due diligence and know that we have at least tried to reach out to the pastoral teams. But what really did work was you guys yourselves, the students. And I worked with the likes of the Drug Science Student Society, which Anna heads up, and also the SSDP teams across the UK, to really start building an army of student ambassadors who have really helped bring this campaign alive and bring it to fruition and get materials out there during Freshers Week over the last couple of weeks mostly. So as part of the comms output for this campaign, we created a couple of case study videos with students who are on Project 2021. We had organic and paid campaigns on social media. So you've probably seen lots of that stuff happening on our Facebook, our Instagram, on our Twitter. And we encouraged all our students to share and tag Drug Science as well in that activity. We've been getting out there on our newsletter comms with activity. We released a press release for student newspapers and student websites, and as well as a blog article on the Drug Science website. We, of course, have this student conference itself to help raise awareness. And we're also looking at planning future events as well with specific universities. And I'm going to show you now the student pack of materials which we created for predominantly for Freshers Week activity. So here are our posters. These went out at A3 and A2 size. Hopefully some of you guys will have seen these out at universities. If you're interested in getting some, well, I'll tell you in a moment how you can print off your own, or just send me an email and we can try and organize some posters to get out to you guys as well if you haven't got any. So these posters we actually turned into quite cool GIFs, which hopefully you can see playing now. So these went out on social media. And as you can see, it's basically our posters being brought to life, which is really fun. And getting across some of our key messages there around just cannabis being legal to prescribe, which is shocking that how few people really still know that. I went to a cannabis festival last month called Product Earth, and even people who are using cannabis medically already, they don't realize that, you know, the actual kind of legal status of cannabis, that it's been legal for medical use since for 3 years now. So these are our two student patient videos, which you can watch on YouTube with Lucy, who's actually a patient advocate for the project, and also with Tim, who's just started university up in Chester. And yeah, these videos are available on our YouTube channel, so do please check them out. This is the leaflet that we produced, especially for students and young people, to really address the stigma, tell the truth, which is obviously what drug science is all about, and present the current problem, like why we're not actually kind of getting cannabis out there on the NHS, and how Project 2021 is a solution to help enable that to happen. And finally, of course, how you can help, which I'm going to come on to in a moment. This was a flyer we produced for kind of talking about Project 2021, the process and how you can join as a patient. And what Freshers Week wouldn't be Freshers Week without badges and stickers. So that was really fun. We got lots of stickers out there, and hopefully kind of you'll see them at your universities as well, if your universities have student ambassadors with us as well. So yeah, they've been proven very, very successful and much liked. And here is all the student stuff in action at Freshers Week. So thank you guys so much for anyone who's here and watching and who's helped us spread the word at your freshers fairs. You can see all the posters there being displayed, and people giving away stickers and badges. We've been really, really thrilled with how many people have been sharing and tagging us on their social channels, and I just please urge you to keep doing that. So just to wrap up, what's next and how can you help? Well, first off, you can print off your own resources at home using our Google Drive folder, which has got all those leaflets and the posters that you've just seen, and the social media posts with some suggested copy. All that is in the Google Drive folder, and you can find the link to that Google Drive folder on our most recent September update for T21 on the Drug Science website. And also that will have been sent in our last newsletter if you're subscribed to our newsletter. So please do that if you can. We only send out monthly emails. We don't bombard you with anything more than that. Another thing you can do is share our social media posts and tag Drug Science, and then we can share back. You can tell your friends and family the truth about medical cannabis. The likelihood is they probably don't know. So get yourself one of our leaflets via the Google Drive folder, educate yourself, and then educate your friends and family. Download our free student educational modules, which I've already mentioned. Tell your doctor about Project 2021. Tell your GP about Project 2021. And finally, we are working with different university societies already about holding in-person events on medical cannabis and drug policy. So if you're interested in working with us to put together one of those in-person events and maybe get one of our team or one of our people that we work in tandem with over to your university to give a talk in person or to organize an online webinar, then get in touch with me. My email address is on the screen there, as is my LinkedIn. So please do get in touch. It's always so wonderful for it to hear from the students.
Yeah,
and to collaborate. Okay, I'm going to stop there.
Fantastic. That was great. Thank you so much, Max. And also, having used those posters at our freshers talking points, so if you are interested, definitely do get in touch with Max. So unfortunately, and as always the case with these things, in the interest of time, we're going to jump on to the next section, but thank you all so much. And Mike, Ray and Mags, if you'd be happy to try and answer some of the questions in the Q&A if you're sticking around for a bit, I'm sure everyone would really appreciate that. So for our next section, we will be looking at the different approaches to drugs in society and harm reduction. So we'll be hearing from an expert in the field, which is Professor Alex Stevens, who's a professor of criminology at the University of Kent. And then we will then be hearing from Alina Salmon, who will be telling us about her involvement with drug science and how she's been helping to gather information and evidence for communicating effective harm reduction. So with that, I will hand over to Alex.
Thanks very much, Anna, and it's great to have this opportunity in this forum, especially to talk about harm reduction, which is part of my work as a criminologist. I'm going to talk about what harm reduction is, for those of you who haven't got familiar with that concept. I'll talk a bit about how I got into harm reduction, and then how you might want to get into harm reduction in the many different ways that that's possible, before handing over to Alina to give examples of how she got into harm reduction. I'm going to read out a definition of harm reduction, which has been produced by another charity that I'm involved with called Harm Reduction International. Harm reduction refers to policies, programs, and practices that aim to minimize negative health, social, and legal impacts associated with drugs, and very importantly, associated with drug policies and drug laws. We recognize that drug use can be harmful as well as pleasurable, but we also recognize that drug policies and drug laws, and especially law enforcement, also impose harms upon people. Harm reduction is grounded in justice and human rights. It's not just a pragmatic response to the problems that are associated with drug use and drug policies. It expresses the values that we hold, the promotion of social justice and of human rights. It focuses on positive change and on working with people without judgment, coercion, discrimination, or requiring that they stop using drugs as a precondition of support. And I suppose that is considered to be a defining feature of harm reduction, that we're not expecting people to stop using drugs before we can help them reduce the problems that are associated with using drugs and the legal and other controls that are placed upon them. Now, harm reduction is a developing concept. It started out decades ago, started by people who use drugs themselves. Originally, the concept came from unions of drug users. For example, people in Rotterdam who were injecting heroin and other drugs, who were finding that viral hepatitis was a problem. This is even before the HIV epidemic. And so those people who use drugs developed schemes for gaining access and providing clean injecting equipment. And that's become a defining model of harm reduction. The idea that if you're using drugs, you should have access to equipment that enables you to use those drugs more safely. Harm reduction was then became part of the major response to the HIV epidemic of the 1980s. And Merseyside played a key role. And so people like Pat O'Hare, Julian Buchanan, but various people using drugs in Merseyside noticed that there was this huge epidemic of HIV spreading amongst people who were injecting drugs, and developed these effective mechanisms to prevent them transmitting that disease. There was also a huge outbreak in Edinburgh, for example, and people like Dr. Roy Robertson were key in introducing opioid substitution prescription programs in order to enable people to stop using street heroin and to start using clinical substitutes instead. So the origins of harm reduction are in injecting drug use and the response to HIV. But over the years, it's become a much wider response to a wider range of issues and a wider range of drugs. So, for example, these days we see harm reduction being practiced through the testing of drugs at festivals. And the charity We Are the Link, for example, which has been working at festivals and sometimes has been able to do what they call front of house drug testing, where people bring along the drugs they're thinking of using at their festival and are able to be given information about the actual content of that drug rather than what it was sold as to them. And this is something that's been happening on the continent in the Netherlands for many years. It's a novelty only in the UK. But it's another form of harm reduction which doesn't expect people to necessarily stop using drugs, but acknowledges that the harms of drug use can be reduced even while people continue to use them. Indeed, many people who find out from the drug testing services that the loop provides that their drugs don't contain what they thought they did, actually do choose to bin them rather than take the risk of using them. Harm reduction has been expanded in a different way by law enforcement agencies to think of themselves as being harm reduction agencies as well. So, for example, for a while, the Serious Organised Crime Agency, the precursor to the National Crime Agency, described itself as a harm reduction agency, that it was about reducing the harm. So targeting its efforts on the basis of not just who's breaking the law, but who's actually causing the most harm. Now, many people in the harm reduction movement are very skeptical of the ability of law enforcement agencies to do actual harm reduction. As you'll have seen in the definition, or heard in the definition I just read out, that harm reduction stands against coercion and against discrimination. And one of the harms that the harm reduction movement increasingly sees is the disproportionality of law enforcement. We see this in England and especially in London with massive disproportionality in stop and search for arrests for drugs. We know, for example, that 57% of stop and searches are carried out under the pretext that somebody's searching for a drug offence. And we know that black people are 9 times more likely than white people are to be stopped and searched for drugs, even though there's not much evidence that black people are using drugs more often than white people. Indeed, the evidence rather suggests the reverse. And harm reduction has expanded its remit to include more direct action to reduce the harms of law enforcement. Indeed, harm reduction is moving towards more explicit endorsement of the decriminalisation of drug possession in order to reduce the harms that are done by the criminal justice system. The International Network of People Who Use Drugs recently put out a very interesting report in which it called for not just depenalisation, removing the penalties while not changing the law, or diversion away from punishment and into treatment systems, but for what we and they call the full decriminalisation of drug possession, which is to remove the criminal offence from the law so that it is no longer a criminal offence to possess drugs for one's own personal use. And I would see that as being a contemporary development of the idea of harm reduction. Another new frontier for harm reduction in this country, if not other countries, is the idea that we should be providing spaces where people can use drugs that they have bought on the illicit market in safe and hygienic places where they can access emergency medical treatment if they need it, and can also be given advice about how to improve their housing situation and get into drug treatment if they want to. These so-called drug consumption rooms or supervised injecting facilities are well established in many countries, including Australia, Canada, Germany. There's 20 drug consumption rooms in Germany, and they seem to operate without any problems with the law and have been shown in several research studies to be effective in reducing drug overdoses, reducing the transmission of viral hepatitis and HIV, but without increasing drug use or causing up what's known as a honeypot effect, or what's purportedly going to happen where people are attracted to these places and they cause neighborhood disorder. Indeed, the opposite has been shown in the studies, which show that by helping people to get out of using drugs in unsafe and public places, it increases neighborhood immunity. And, for example, discarded needles reduce in the area. And so drug science, under my chairship, have set up a working group, the Safer Injecting Facilities Working Group, of which the aim is to enable the testing of these facilities in the UK. The Home Office states that this would be illegal under the Misuse of Drugs Act. We dispute that. We think the Home Office is over-interpreting the wording of the Misuse of Drugs Act. And so we hope to work with partners in the treatment sector and with people who use drugs in order to develop a feasibility and then an evaluation of a drug consumption room or safer injecting facility in the UK. So these are some of the ways in which harm reduction has developed. And I just want to name check Dr. Russell Newcomb here, who's key in developing the definition and practices of harm reduction over the years. Dedicated drug user and enjoyer of drugs himself, and also a very interesting researcher in this field. My entry into the field took a rather different form. Here's where I tell you that you don't have to be a clinical researcher to get into drug science, and certainly not into harm reduction. For those of you who aren't studying a clinical subject, you'll be, I hope, relieved to hear that I was a humanities student to start with. My first degree was in French. That did give me a good grounding in the social theories and social research methods that I now use, but I transferred to thinking about criminology, partly through an arts project in which we worked jointly between students at the University of Sussex and people who were imprisoned in Feltham Young Offenders Institution. We did a project with English National Opera about the opera Pelléas and Mélisande. And by doing arts workshops with this group of very interesting young men, just as creative, intelligent as many of the people I was at university with, that got me thinking about, why are we doing this to people? Why are we putting these people behind a door and wasting their lives for them and for us when we could be doing so much more with them? And that got me thinking about how to get involved in improving our systems of criminal justice. So I volunteered with a charity called Fairbridge, which ran outdoor activities for people who are at risk of offending. And also I became a volunteer for the probation service itself. And through that got a job with a charity called Prisoners Abroad, which provides advice, information and support for British people who are imprisoned abroad. Many of them were there for drug smuggling. I was a French speaker, thanks to my degree, so I was in charge of the prisoners who were in charge, helping the families of the prisoners who were caught at the French border, often with quite large quantities of hashish at that time, or a few hundred ecstasy pills. And it got me thinking about, again, why is it that we're allowing drugs through that border, which are perhaps more harmful, and as David Nutt's research shown, definitely more harmful than MDMA, for example, massive quantities of wine being imported from France into the UK, whereas we were stopping MDMA pills coming into the UK from the Netherlands. And again, made me think about, the absurdities and anomalies of the way we deal with drugs, and encouraged me to get more into my criminological studies that eventually led to me doing research on drug treatment in the criminal justice system and in others places. And now my research focuses on this overlap between drugs, crime and public health, which is partly why I'm so interested in the prospect of evaluating drug consumption rooms, as well as depenalisation, diversion and decriminalisation as they develop in the UK and elsewhere. As you'll see from that journey, this means that there are plenty of opportunities for students and others with a very wide range of backgrounds to get involved in harm reduction, either in supporting the services that do actual harm reduction. So many of the people I know in the field started out as students by going along to a local drug treatment service and offering their services as a volunteer to work in a needle exchange program, for example. But there's also many other opportunities to work as researchers or in communications and marketing around how we reduce the harms of drug use and drug laws. And I want to finish by talking about one of the more recent developments in harm reduction, which is how do we engage with the idea of drugs not just being potentially harmful, but pleasurable as well. And those of you who've read Carl Hart's fascinating new book, Drug Use for Grown-Ups, will know his aversion to the concept of harm reduction because it builds in this assumption that drugs are necessarily dangerous and harmful, and we should be thinking more about how to maximize the pleasures rather than reduce the harms. And I see this as another new frontier in harm reduction that we'll be able to discuss right here, but as harm reduction develops, and as I hope you get involved in it. I'll stop here and hand over to Alina to talk about these opportunities as well. Thanks, Alina.
Thank you, Alex. I do have some slides, so I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, is that working? Perfect. Great. Yeah. So this was really a great transition to what I want to talk about, and that's also a little bit related to how to get involved if you're more of a social scientist, I guess, because I'm a social psychologist. I'm a lecturer in social psychology. I'm just finishing up my PhD in something completely unrelated. But I've always been, not always, but I've been really passionate about drug policy reform since I started uni and started reading about it. And I also volunteered at a supervised injection facility during my undergrad. And now in the recent few years, I've become really fascinated by the emerging research on the medical uses of psychedelics and cannabis. So I really wanted to kind of branch out and move away a little bit from some of my my other topics towards this kind of topic. However, I don't have a clinical psychology background or pharmacology background, so I didn't really know what to do, and I contacted loads of labs working with medical psychedelics, trying to get involved in clinical trials, which is quite difficult if you don't have any medical training. So I got lots of no's, lots of no thank yous, lots of we're very sorry, but we're getting loads of requests. But I wasn't too worried about it because I just think that this field is kind of growing so much at the moment that I think there will be more and more opportunities. So I just kind of persisted and kept going. And I contacted James from Drug Science to ask if there was anything that I could get involved with as a voluntary research assistant. And James said he did have some work for me that he said was not very glamorous. It was more kind of admin-y, but it turned out to actually be a really cool research project that I got involved in. And that was about supervised injection facilities, and more specifically about public opinion and how to communicate about, I'm just going to call them SIFs now, just to make it a bit shorter, how to communicate about SIFs to kind of to grow public support and to improve public opinion. And this was largely a literature research where I looked at lots and lots and lots of evidence that other people gathered and tried to kind of synthesize it to build a clear picture of what do stakeholders in the public think about SIFs, are they correct in what they think about SIFs, and how can we improve their opinions. So the first thing that I did was essentially just try to gauge what the extent of public support versus opposition is. Then I did some research into what kind of communication strategies could be useful to improve public opinion. And then I tried to identify the most common misconceptions that people hold about SIFs. And finally, I wrote up a report for Drug Science, kind of combining all of this evidence into recommendations about how to communicate about SIFs. I'm just going to go through the research that I've done briefly, just so that you get an idea of what kind of things you can do as a social scientist in this kind of field, what kind of methods can be used, what kind of outputs you can have that can actually benefit you in your CV as well. So the first thing I did was I tried to find all of the research looking at what kind of percentage of people actually supports versus opposes SIFs, and what kind of reasons people might have to oppose SIFs. And what I generally found was that in areas where SIFs already exist, so where they are sanctioned, public opinion tends to improve after a SIF is opened, and qualitative evidence, so kind of interviews and focus groups, seem to suggest that this is because residents notice positive changes in their neighborhoods. So they notice, for example, fewer discarded syringes and so on. However, where we don't have sanctioned SIFs, public support is quite low. And in the UK, the latest figure that I could find is from 2015, when there were plans to open a SIF in Brighton. And at that point, only about 50% of people supported opening a SIF in the UK. However, when we look at research with people who inject drugs, they show a really high willingness and high support for SIFs. And what's quite encouraging is that it's especially those who have the highest number of vulnerabilities who seem the most keen to use SIFs. And these are exactly the people that we would obviously want to reach. So that's quite encouraging. Then what really emerged really strongly is the role of stigma in public opposition to SIFs. People who inject drugs are amongst the most stigmatized groups in society. It's really difficult to get people to care about people who inject drugs. They're often blamed for their drug-related problems rather than taking systemic factors into account. And what we find is that the higher the stigma that someone holds towards people who inject drugs, the less likely they are to support SIFs, which makes sense. And on the other hand, we also find this so-called not in my backyard phenomenon. So what was striking when looking at the research was that when we ask people whether they generally support the idea of SIFs, at least in the US, where most of this research is from, about 60% actually say, yes, this is a good tool that the US government could use against the opioid crisis. However, when people are asked, would you support this in your own community, this drops to as low as 29%. And that kind of indicates that people don't necessarily disagree with the harm reduction approach, although some people obviously do, but people are concerned about what this might mean for their community. And also, again, the role of the stigma is quite strong here, in that people don't want their neighborhood to be stigmatized by having facilities for people who inject drugs. So this is all a rather bleak picture. So the next step was to look at how public opinion can be improved, and more specifically, what kind of communication strategies can be used to improve public opinion. So how should we talk about CIFs if we want to convince people that they are a good idea? And the first aspect that emerged was how do we actually call these facilities? And here, a language shift away from supervised injection, perhaps towards overdose prevention, could be quite fruitful. So when participants were asked whether they supported safe consumption sites, 29% said they would support their legalization, whereas the number was at 49% when people were asked whether they would support overdose prevention sites, which kind of directly highlights that if we don't legalize these facilities, people will keep dying. So this research is from the US as well, and they only tested these two labels against each other, so we don't actually know whether there's any other labels that might work even better, and that could perhaps be a good and important avenue for future research to actually test what kind of name for these facilities might be the best. Message content is obviously important as well. What kind of information do we give people about CIFs? Here a representative study from Scotland found that giving people factual information alone, so giving people the evidence about CIFs alone, is not as successful at garnering support as giving them factual information, as well as preemptively refuting some of the most common misconceptions that people hold, as well as adding a sort of sympathetic narrative. And by that, I mean a kind of emotional story that talks about someone who is directly affected by drug-related harm. So often these are relatives of people who have died from a heroin overdose or something like that. So combining these three building blocks of communication had the highest likelihood of increasing support for CIFs. So if we should refute common misconceptions, then it's obviously important to know what these are. And this was the largest part of the project and also the most fun part of the project. So here I did a really extensive literature research looking at qualitative interviews and focus groups with community stakeholders, looking at more large-scale quantitative surveys with the general public, and also analyzing some communication from the UK Home Office to essentially distill all of the different beliefs that people hold about CIFs. And the next step was to then look at the empirical evidence about the efficacy and safety of CIFs to evaluate whether these concerns are actually valid, or whether they are based on evidence, or whether they are not valid. And I'm just going to, so most of them are not valid, most of them are either not based on evidence, or we even have quite good evidence to refute them. And that's why I think it's fair to call these the misconceptions. And I'm just going to briefly go through these. And they fell into four broad categories. The first one being these so-called not in my backyard concerns, so concerns about community safety. Concerns such as CIFs will stigmatize or degrade my neighborhood, will damage local businesses, will attract people who use drugs and drug dealers into the area, will increase local crime, drug dealing, littering, and so on. And for some of these, we don't actually have any good evidence. For example, there's not really any good evidence showing the effect on businesses. But for most of these, we actually have quite a lot of evidence now showing that this is not the case. In fact, there's some evidence even suggesting that crime in areas around CIFs decreases, that littering, especially littering of syringes, decreases, and so on. Then the second large group were concerns about the harm reduction approach itself. So people either disagreeing with the harm reduction approach or not believing that it works. So concerns such as CIFs enable and encourage more drug use, deter people from seeking treatment by offering an alternative to treatment, or that CIFs send the wrong message or imply that the community endorses illegal behaviors. In fact, we know from a lot of the countries where CIFs are established that they don't encourage more drug use, so drug use patterns don't really change significantly after a CIF is opened. And in fact, CIFs can encourage treatment and can be a sort of bridge for people who wouldn't normally enter treatment to take a first step towards treatment. The third group were concerns about law and law enforcement. So Alex already talked a little bit about this idea that CIFs contravene the Misuse of Drugs Act, which is contested. CIFs imply that the government tolerates illegal activities, and CIFs make drug law enforcement difficult, or that CIFs support the illegal drug market. In fact, by helping people into treatment and thereby reducing drug use, CIFs can actually create quite a lot of damage to the illegal drug market. So again, either these are not based on evidence, or we even have evidence to refute them. And the fourth group were practical and financial concerns, such as people who inject drugs won't even use the service, the extent of the problem in my area doesn't warrant a CIF, or that CIFs won't be financially viable. We know that people who inject drugs actively use the service where CIFs exist, and we know that in the UK, people who inject drugs are very willing and very keen on using the service if it existed. And we also know that CIFs can be financially viable. They can essentially pay for themselves because they reduce costs in other parts of the healthcare system. And there's also a lot of studies using mathematical modeling showing that in a lot of places, CIFs are theoretically financially viable. So just based on all of this, I then wrote up a report with the main recommendations, and I'm just going to very briefly go through the main recommendations. The first one being communication about CIFs should use non-stigmatizing languages and frame CIFs perhaps as overdose prevention centers. However, we don't really know whether this would replicate in the UK, and we also don't know whether there's perhaps an even better label. But what we do know is that supervised injection facility is perhaps not the best label. So yeah, I don't know why I used it throughout this talk, to be honest. I'm probably preaching to the choir here anyway and don't need to convince anyone. They should provide factual and evidence-based information about the efficacy and safety of CIFs. They should refute the most common misconceptions about CIFs, and especially the ones that people care about the most, and these seem to be public amenity and safety concerns. And finally, they should include destigmatizing narratives, for example, perspectives from people who inject drugs themselves. So these kind of narratives shift the focus away from the facilities, from the injecting, and towards the humans that we're trying to protect and that we're trying to save. Examples that were used in research were, for example, entries from guest books or client books in existing CIFs, such as this one. This is from a CIF client in Victoria in Canada, who said that it's been so helpful to me, like very helpful, because I know I can use and I don't have to worry about overdosing and being by myself. I have reassurance because that's always going through my mind, like, oh God, is this going to be the last time I shoot? Like, I've got to say goodbye to people. So the idea is that hopefully this can kind of reverse this stigmatization and dehumanization of people who inject drugs. And yeah, and apart from the internal report for drug science, I'm also just finishing up an academic paper, hopefully for publication in the Drug Science Journal, together with Anne Schlack from Drug Science, which will be really cool for me as well, because that's something I can put on my CV and something that will hopefully help me get more of a foot in the door. I've really loved working on this project. It's something so I worked in CIF for a while, so I kind of know how it runs. But the evidence around it, and especially the evidence around what people think about it, I had very little knowledge about. So I learned loads whilst working on this project. Yeah, it was really cool to get involved, and I really hope to be able to do more work with drug science in the future. And I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. That was great. I feel like I've learned a lot. We've got some questions. We've got a little bit of time for them. So something that's come up is sort of this idea that we have obviously got a wealth of evidence, you know, from other countries about how effective harm reduction can be. And in fact, from this country, I think, you know, something I learned on this journey was that we actually had a doctor in Merseyside who was prescribing heroin-assisted therapy in the 80s, and those clinics were incredibly effective and then got shut down in the 90s. But kind of despite all of this, despite all this evidence, and someone's mentioned all the economic evidence of how effective it is to implement these harm reduction strategies, still it's just such an uphill kind of battle to see these harm reduction policies implemented. And do either of you have any thoughts on sort of why that is, or whether we're starting to reach a tipping point?
I do have thoughts, and I wrote an article about it. In 2016, I chaired the work of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs on a report on reducing opioid-related deaths in the UK. And that had 13 recommendations, I think, and the government accepted all of them apart from one, which was to consider opening drug consumption rooms. But 2 years later, they still haven't actually implemented any of these recommendations. So I started thinking about this and looking at political speeches and discourse, and ended up writing an article which is called Being Human and the Moral Sidestep. Because my two answers in that article to why we're not actually implementing these evidence-informed measures to reduce the record levels of drug-related deaths that we're experiencing in this country are, one, that we are not, in our political discourse, thinking of people who inject heroin as fully human beings who deserve dignity and agency, and therefore we're not putting in place the measures to save their lives that we would do if these were not working class people who were middle-aged, who were thrown on the scrap heap in the 80s and 90s and they're forgotten about. If these were middle-class young people who were dying in large numbers, as we saw when much smaller numbers died around novel psychoactive substances in the mid-2010s, there would be legislation, there would be action. There isn't. The other reason that I identified in this Being Human and the Moral Sidestep article was the moral sidestep. The idea that when we put evidence to politicians that these measures, as Alina has so eloquently shown, that their evidence is out there showing these measures are effective, they don't cause the harms you think they're going to do, and in actual fact they save you money. We're not met with a rejection of their evidence. We're met with, well, you're liberal, we're not. We are tough on drugs. And I describe that as a moral sidestep. It's not arguing back on the basis of the evidence. It's arguing on the basis, well, we just don't agree with you on moral grounds. So it's a combination of not seeing people who inject heroin as fully human beings and sidestepping the evidence that we're throwing at the politicians means that we continue to have this inaction, which we still see today, and we've seen repeated again in speeches at the Conservative Party conference on drug-related deaths, while we're putting all this attention on the supposed harms of recreational drug use and how we've got to be tough on it.
I mean, definitely. I just think it's just such an interesting topic, really, and probably could spend the rest of the session delving into it. Lena, is there anything that you want to add on that topic, or I'll ask another question?
No, I don't have anything to add. No, thanks.
Sure. So there's a question for both of you actually about what your opinions are on the British method of drug control. So I think that's something I alluded to very briefly. So for people who don't know about this is sort of referring to the clinic of Dr. John Marks, who was in Merseyside, I think in Liverpool, and he prescribed heroin basically for his heroin patients and found that kind of allowed them to gain a bit of control on their lives. But yeah, do you have any sort of thoughts about that, either of you? Presumably yes.
Alina, do you want to go first?
As far as I know, heroin-assisted treatment works. So the evidence is on his side. And
can I just explain what happened? What happened was that Margaret Thatcher met Reagan, and Reagan said, "We don't like this guy prescribing heroin," and so she basically stopped him. And that really is indicative of how the Americans have controlled our drug laws actually since 1971, but that's perhaps the most personal example.
But it goes back to a fundamental divide that occurred between American and British drug policy back in about 1919, when the Supreme Court in America decided it was illegal to prescribe heroin to people who were addicted to it, whereas at that time doctors were prescribing it quite freely, quite often to their own colleagues who'd become dependent on heroin. That's why it's known as the British system, because from the 1920s onwards, it was state-endorsed prescribing of heroin to people who were dependent on it.
The Americans hated it. They hated us doing that, and particularly after Nixon and the war on drugs, they hated us even more. So eventually we complied. I mean, all British drug laws, with the new exception of the Psychoactive Substances Act, have been made at the behest of America. We might have taken a long time to comply, as with heroin and with cannabis, but we eventually complied.
There's a really interesting part for anyone who's interested in a book called Chasing the Scream, which I'm sure many of you have read, but there is a very harrowing account of what happened to a lot of the patients when that clinic in Merseyside was shut down. And so I think that's well worth a read. So one of the other questions that I think is quite interesting to ask around this topic is, obviously we're talking about kind of communicating with adults, and I don't know how within this field this is for you, but kind of what do you think we can do perhaps to communicate with younger people and things? Because I remember my drug education at school, it was very bad. It was just sort of drugs are bad, end of discussion, basically. So do you think there's sort of, have you looked at any of the kind of outreach to younger ages at all?
Well, I'm sorry to tell you that my students tell me that really bad drug education is still being done in the schools, to the extent that one of my students told me that she was exposed quite recently to DARE, the drug abuse resistance education program, which has been shown in trials in the States not only to be ineffective, but sometimes to increase drug use amongst young people. There is an excellent report by the Advisory Council on Misuse of Drugs, led by my colleague, Professor Harry Sumnall, on prevention, which provides a very good overview of the evidence of what works in helping people reduce the risks they're running around drug use at a young age. Unfortunately, again, it's one of those ACMD reports, and David knows this syndrome pretty well, that lies on the shelf, having great evidence in it, but being almost completely unimplemented.
Yeah, I remember I actually did DARE, and we did a song to Grease Lightning about resisting drugs. It was a very odd time.
You were dancing as well, were you, Anna?
Yeah, it was bizarre. It was bizarre. I was 9 years old and it was terrible looking at it. So another question I can see in the chat is whether America still has the same influence on UK's drug policies today, which is a very interesting question.
That's a really interesting question. As David has suggested, for decades, America was the prime mover in drug legislation. So it enforced on Britain. Britain was kicking and screaming when this happened, because Britain was still making loads of money from selling drugs worldwide when America was trying to shut us down, and succeeded. And then from then on, whenever people tried to move away from the prohibitionist mainstream, America was one of the prime actors who would stop you doing it. I mean, for example, by threatening foreign aid for countries who threaten to step out of line. But since America has not been able to follow the international conventions itself, by legalizing cannabis for medical and then recreational use in several states in America, the United States is in clear contravention of the international drug control systems treaties. America is no longer able to be such a powerful voice at the UN. I mean, I know diplomats who've had personal attacks mobilized against them by American diplomats to stop them talking about harm reduction at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, the meeting where the international drug control treaties are monitored. That was 5-10 years ago. Now the Americans are much more quiet on these subjects, but the Chinese and the Russians have taken up that mantle of being the prime prohibitionists who will try and stop and will punish through diplomatic and other means countries for stepping out of line with international prohibition.
Thank you. And I think we've got time for just one last question. So actually, Alina, I wanted to ask you as well, because obviously you spoke a lot about how we communicate this harm reduction stuff effectively. And have you done any work, or are you aware of any work on sort of how we format this information as well? Because obviously how you actually physically reach people can be so important, because it's amazing what you think you're seeing on Facebook or something another group of people has never heard of.
Yes, I think in terms of the sympathetic narratives, for example, a lot is being done with videos. I think making it quite visual and quite sort of immersive and engaging might be really good. So actually seeing people talk about losing their loved ones. I don't know about formatting of formatting otherwise. So what I've been working on is essentially a frequently asked questions type format, where all of the concerns that people have are kind of gone through in sort of an FAQ kind of way. So things like, oh, but won't this increase crime in my area? And then you immediately kind of refute with the evidence. But I don't have any empirical evidence that works better than any other way. I don't think there's anything out there yet. That's actually the part of the project that where the evidence was the most sparse. Like I couldn't really find loads of research on how to communicate best. So there's definitely still a lot of things that need to be explored.
Amazing. Well, thank you both. so much, Alina and Alex. We will go on to our next section, but yeah, I'm sure I can speak on everyone's behalf and say that was just absolutely fantastic. And as always, if you have any more questions, please just pop them in the Q&A, and I'm sure Alina and Alex can have a look at those. So we will now move on to the last section of this webinar. Thank you for sticking with us all this time. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our next few speakers. We've of course got Professor David Nutt, who I'm sure does not need much of an introduction, but I will give one just in case. So he of course is the founder of Drug Science, having been fired from the thing that we shall not mention. For essentially suggesting that we should use evidence-based drug policy, which seems like it's not an insane suggestion, but here we are. And then we will be listening to Dr. Hannah Thurger, who will be telling us about all the work that she's been doing at Drug Science and how she got involved following her PhD in neuroscience to taking on the role of study coordinator. So Dave, I'll hand over to you first.
Well, I think I let Hannah go first. She doesn't want to hang around when I give a talk. Go on, Hannah, you say your thing, and then I'll wind it up, because all right.
Hi everyone, really, really nice to be speaking today. So I'm just going to kind of give you an overview of how I end up working at Drug Science. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Has that worked okay?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. So from bench science to drug science, so I'm kind of providing the perspective of a more basic researcher. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about my undergraduate degree to my PhD, and eventually how I started working here at Drug Science. So my undergraduate degree was actually in biochemistry, but like many people here, it was really the brain that fascinated me and led on to a PhD in neuroscience. Not related to drugs at all. It was looking at inflammation in repair processes after stroke. So this is what you'd call more of a bench science approach. I was doing experiments in the lab using cell cultures and seeing how they might respond to a stimulus. Following on from that PhD, I then started working for another charity called the British Neuroscience Association, as an executive officer. So during my time at Manchester, I met the wonderful Jo Neill, who everyone heard speak earlier, and started some work in harm reduction. And really before that, I'd always kind of been interested in drug research and harm reduction. Like everyone, read Dave Nutt's books. I remember helping putting towards the crowdfunding for the LSD trial at Imperial and attending that talk whilst I was at university, dragging a friend along to come with me and make her sit through the presentation. And so it was a great opportunity to be able to start working as an honorary research assistant at Drug Science. And then this led on to eventually working as a study coordinator. So it's probably nice to give you a bit of an overview of all the different types of things you can do as an honorary research assistant. So just to give you an idea of what I've done in my time working for Drug Science. So I've worked on a few different drug information pages. So for example, I did one on 2CB, one on DMT. If you enjoy searching the literature and reading about different drugs, their effects, this is a really good opportunity to get involved. You can create really good evidence-based drug information and harm reduction resources that really do get used widely by the general public. Another great way to get involved is through article writing. So this could be in the form of blogs. It could be more general approaches, helping people keep up to date with different drug science activities. And another major way that you've heard a lot about today is the educational resource slide sets. So these are great because they're more like a mini project. You really start on them from start to finish. Again, you have to search literature, you need to research it, you need to plan it, and you can produce this final product that will get used by, hopefully, in the educational setting. So I did one on supervised injection facilities and also one on emergency medical treatment. So again, really nice to be able to use your research skills in a different way and improve your kind of written communication. So it's then led on to my current role. which is as a study coordinator. So again, bringing together your research skills, your planning, and your project management. So the take-home messages for the students and early career people attending here today. If you're coming in from more of a basic scientific background, there's lots of different ways you can get involved. It's about applying your scientific understanding, your research skills, whether that's your research skills in terms of searching the literature or in running potential trials, and bringing in different project management skills that you might develop during your master's or your PhD project. So something else that Jo Neill kind of talked about earlier is that there will hope to be more research at the basic level. People are more interested now in understanding molecular mechanisms of medical psychedelics and medical cannabis. So there might be more opportunities there as well to look into. And feel free to ask me any questions about the work I've done or the types of projects you could get involved with drug science. That was a very quick overview. Oh, it stopped sharing.
Great. Are there any questions for Hannah? Specific questions, or should we let them put them into the chat? I don't know. Let's have a look.
I think we'll get into questions in a moment, Dave. So do you want to go first, and we'll do a round finishing up with a Q&A.
Thank you.
Sure. Right. Let me. Okay, I'll share my screen. I'll just fill in some of the gaps in what the others. It's been a pretty impressive overview, but there's still a few things left to say. So I will just do those over the next 20 minutes or so. So you hopefully can see my screen. I thought I'd have to show you the classic image of the sacking of the book of Cannabis falling from my hand. Can you all see that? Good. Interesting, I was sacked by New Labour. Gordon Brown, and was the Prime Minister. Alan Johnson was the Home Secretary. So any criticisms I make of the current government can be, you can rest assured I have the same kind of opinions of the previous one. So as a result of that sacking, I set it the charity Drug Science, and we were very fortunate in that we received a donation from a man called Toby Jackson. He emailed me a couple of days after my sacking saying if I made a donation of the same as what it cost to run the ACMD, would you run a real ACMD that could tell the truth rather than be constrained by government? And of course I said yes. And I worked with the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies, these three great people, for a few years to get it up and running. So what have we done over the last decade or so? Well, we've done all the things you've heard about today, but we've done a few other things. We've done some very sophisticated analysis of the harms of drugs and also drug policy using multi-criteria decision analysis. We've got a website, which is a wonderful website, covers a whole range of issues, drug information, policy questions, etc. We've done some remarkable international things. I think we were instrumental in actually getting the WHO to review cannabis as a medicine in 2016. And we also helped change the law and the punishment of for methamphetamine use, particularly in the Maori in New Zealand. We have a journal, which you've heard mentioned, which is going from strength to strength. We have the side sets, which again, we've already mentioned. And we have podcasts, which I don't think have been mentioned, but hopefully you've all listened to them. And now I think we have about 35 podcasts where I chat to people of interest. And they help get across to the public the kind of things that we're interested in and the sorts of issues that they should be interested in. So if you've not listened to them, do so. And if you like them, then encourage your friends and family to listen. So here's the website. Hopefully you've all looked at the website, and there's loads going on there. So it's definitely worth dipping in at least once a week. This is perhaps the first major publication that Drug Science produced 10 years or so ago now. It's the now famous analysis of the comparative harms of different drugs using this new technique called MCDA. And it's become almost a meme for drug harms in Britain and around the world. And it shows that the most harmful drug in the UK is alcohol. And the reason for that is the size of the red bar on the left-hand side. And the red bar is driven, the size of that bar is due to the enormous social costs of alcohol. And it also showed that the drugs, many drugs which are seen as very harmful under the current Misuse of Drugs Act, drugs like magic mushrooms, like LSD, like ecstasy, which are all in Class A, actually are some of the least harmful drugs in Britain, both to the user in blue and the society in red. And that really proved what many of us have been saying for a long time, that the UK drugs laws aren't remotely based on evidence of harm. They're based on other factors. And those are complex, and we can perhaps talk about them in the discussion, but they're political rather than medical. And over the last 10 years, we can look back and just see what the UK government's actually failed to do in a whole range of different areas relating to drugs and drug policy. So they've achieved this remarkable statistic now that alcohol is now the leading cause of death in men under the age of 50, and it'll soon be the leading cause of death in women. They banned alternatives to alcohol like cat and nitrous oxide. They've introduced policies which have led to the year-on-year opioid and cocaine deaths reaching each year a new all-time high. We've had a spate of deaths from PMA and PMMA because of a failed attempt to stop MDMA production and use. We've got an epidemic of synthetic cannabinoids called spice, leading to deaths, particularly in prisons and the homeless. And we now have one of the most repressive drug laws in the world, which is the Psychoactive Substances Act. So it's been a litany of disasters in terms of drug policy. And we've had horrible limitation of public debate, which was culminated in a remarkable episode in 2015 when the drugs minister actually resigned because a report he produced criticizing the Conservative drug policy, or coalition drug policy at the time, was actually basically not allowed to be published. So it's been a nightmare in terms of rationality and evidence and honesty. And of course, you almost quote attributed Einstein, he is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And that's a really remarkable, accurate appraisal of what British drug policy has been over the last 30 years. And one of the reasons for that is that until very recently, the Home Office, which is vested with the control of a drug policy, refused to accept that reducing harm was what we should be doing. The ambition of the current policy was always to reduce use and not harm. And that Alex Stevens had already talked about that. This is a kind of moral position rather than a rational position. But of course, it's a moral position that doesn't apply to the most popular drug, which is alcohol. And this is a wonderful cartoon, which is obviously a direct parody on Hogarth's Gin Lane, and showing the Cameron being, well, essentially doing a U-turn on his policy to try to deal with drinking. And it's the fact that he and his successors have not done anything about drinking is why alcohol is the leading cause of death in men and will be in women under the age of 50 very soon. And a few interesting things have happened in the last decade or so, which give us perspectives on how things could be different. And these data show the impact of the drug methadone, MCAT, meow meow, on cocaine and amphetamine deaths. So the black line is the number of deaths per million people for cocaine, and the red line for amphetamines, mostly amphetamine sulfate. And you can see cocaine deaths have chugged up and chugged up and chugged up and chugged up. And then in 2008, methadone was legally known. You could buy it over the internet. It could be delivered within hours, and it didn't kill you. And a lot of people switched from cocaine to methadone, and cocaine deaths fell and fell and fell. And this is the most remarkable intervention there's ever been in terms of deaths from cocaine. Also a major fall in deaths from amphetamines too. So this is a kind of goal that government policy wants to achieve, if we're certainly harm reduction policy wants to achieve. We want to stop people dying. But the hysteria that the media created over mephedrone led to it being banned. It was banned just before the 2010 election in a desperate attempt by the man that sacked me, Alan Johnson, to stay in power. And as a consequence of that ban, methadone supplies dried up after about a year. The stockpiles were used up. And look what happened. Cocaine deaths started to rise, and they've reached year on year an all-time high now. Why is that? Well, it's because people aren't stupid. If everything's illegal, you use the best drug, and cocaine's a better drug than mephedrone. But when mephedrone was legal, people used mephedrone because they didn't want to get criminal records. And it was easy to access. You didn't have to go to the back streets. So this is a natural experiment which we should learn from. If you provide safer alternatives, and mephedrone is clearly safer than cocaine, because there were virtually no methadone deaths in that time, then people will generally be rational and seek out safer alternatives. But over the last 100 years, most drug policies have driven people to more harmful drugs rather than less harmful drugs, in the same way as banning mephedrone has led people to go back to the more harmful drug cocaine and amphetamine. Now, one of the other outputs of drug science was this graph, which looks at the comparative toxicity of a range of different drugs. So this is, I think, called the index of fatal toxicity. And the most toxic drugs are opiates like heroin and fentanyl, followed by alpha-methoxytryptamine, and followed by synthetic cannabinoids, followed by GHB, and then followed by these two drugs, PMA and PMMA. And these drugs are twice as toxic, twice as harmful as MDMA, but they're often sold instead of MDMA. And that is a problem, because that leads to deaths because they're more toxic. And the reason they're sold instead of MDMA is because international controls on the production of the precursor of MDMA, safrole, led to people using a different precursor, which made a more toxic substance. So this was completely predictable if you understood the likely outcomes of restricting MDMA production. But also, here's mephedrone. So mephedrone is one of the least harmful of all the drugs that are used. And that's why it should be definitely preferred to cocaine. But banning mephedrone didn't just lead to the rise of cocaine death, it also led to the production of alternatives. And one of them is monkey dust. Monkey dust is a much more powerful and inebriating cathinone than mephedrone. And there was an epidemic of very disturbed behavior in parts of Britain as a result of this more powerful cathinone hitting the streets. And that was a few years ago, but it goes on. And here's the latest report from the Loop. And we work very closely. Drug Science works with Fiona Measham. She's on our committee. She runs the Loop. And now we saw this year new cathinones coming along. One of them is 4-CMC, and the other one is Utolone. And Utolone is a remarkable, powerful drug, and it has a long-lasting effect. It can keep people awake for days. And no one in their right mind wants to take these cathinones. They'd much rather take MDMA. But MDMA when MDMA is not available, people switch. And that's one of the main arguments why we should have a policy. Personally, I think MDMA should be available in some a pure form in pharmacies. And the synthetic cannabinoid story is even worse. There are more deaths from these than there are from PMA and PMMA. And why do we have an outbreak of the use of synthetic cannabinoids? Because we started testing prisoners for smoking cannabis. And the absurdity of that has led to multiple prisons and a lot of harm being provoked to prisoners and also prison guards by these very toxic chemicals, which have never really been tested on anything to make them give us any evidence of their relative harms in there. So we've created this monster of spice simply because we hate the idea or governments hate the idea that people might use drugs. So they want to punish prisoners even more than they punish them by locking them up for 23 hours a day. And the attempt to ban synthetic cannabinoids has just led to a massive explosion in other versions. There are millions of different drugs you could turn into a synthetic cannabinoid, and these are now widely available. It's been estimated that in some open prisons, up to 90% of people are using spice every day. And they're using spice because it's not testable. And the solution that the government's coming up with is spend more money on testing machines, which is completely missing the point. We should be allowing people not to be tested and probably just let them smoke cannabis in prisons. And it's also corrupting prison officers. Smuggling spice into prisons has now become an extremely lucrative business for some prison officers. And then finally, I want to talk about the Psychoactive Substances Act. This is truly one of the most regressive pieces of legislation ever. Because what it does, it bans any psychoactive substance, whether now or ever in the future. It bans anything that could be made. It will ban a substance which made you cleverer, made you live longer if it was psychoactive. It would ban a substance even if it made you vote Tory, if there was any drug that could ever be that powerful, I don't know. With the exceptions of alcohol, tobacco, and coffee. And why are they exempt? Well, they're exempt because they've been around for a long time. And it was truly remarkable reading the debates in Parliament with the embarrassment that the government ministers had when putting forward, knowing full well and saying that, of course, alcohol should be included, but we're not going to exclude it because, well, the alcohol industry really doesn't want it to be included. And I've been particularly involved in trying to stop people being punished for the possession of nitrous oxide. And it's worth reflecting on why nitrous oxide has now become such a hate object to the government. And it all started a few years ago when the Sun newspaper decided to try to get nitrous oxide banned because they could censor soccer players for using it, even though it was legal. And it still is for them to use it, personally. But the Sun realized that people wouldn't get hysterical about gas, which of course is what the old name of nitrous oxide was. So they changed the name. They changed the name to hippie crack. And that was deliberately designed to try to get people hysterical about it. And of course, you know, that's completely ridiculous and outrageous. But it's very typical of the way the media try to portray drugs as being more harmful than they are. So what's the reality about nitrous oxide? Well, it's a great British drug. It was discovered by Priestley. It was popularized by Davy there, the chemist who was the president of the Royal Society. And Priestley used it for exploring consciousness. In over 200 years, which is precedent enough, I would say. There have been no deaths except accidentally, or suicide. It's been used by Coleridge, Southey for poetic inspiration, millions of women for childbirth, and for setting broken bones, etc. And even Prince Harry. No one wanted to try to stop it because Prince Harry's using it, but soccer players are different. And one of the reasons soccer players use nitrous oxide is because it's a hell of a lot better for them than alcohol. They know if they get high on alcohol at a party, they'll have a hangover the next day and that'll impair their performance. But they know if they get out their heads for 50 seconds or so on a balloon of nitrous oxide, they can drive home in an hour or two. So it's much healthier for soccer players and it's much less impairing to their performance. And if you compare the number of deaths between alcohol and nitrous oxide, it's, you know, countless more for alcohol. It's way more toxic. Bother to include nitrous oxide in the assessments of drug harms because it was so harmless. But it's being banned because the Sun and other newspapers following their message have been publishing these images, like on the left, of Raheem Sterling inhaling a balloon of nitrous oxide. What you don't know and what they don't report is what's on the right-hand side. That's Luke Shaw being carried off the pitch in Basel after breaking his leg in a couple of places. People say, oh, he's been given oxygen. He's not been given oxygen. He's been given nitrous oxide. So there are two different ways you can use, soccer players use nitrous oxide. And as you can see, it's not obvious to me which one is good and which one is bad. But now, nitrous oxide got sucked into the Psychoactive Substances Act, and it's now illegal to sell it. If you sell it, you go to prison. And actually now, Patel, the new Home Secretary, wants to make even using it illegal. And the selling is interesting because no one has decided what is the maximum amount you can claim for personal use. So you can go to prison in reality, people are in prison for maybe having 100 whippets, even if they were using it personally. And that's a very bad law. And that's also completely disproportionate to the harms of nitrous oxide. So what do we get to this stupid position? Well, we got to this stupid position because of this woman. I realized that some of you on the call probably weren't even born in 2003. In those days, the Tory party were in opposition, and she was the chairwoman of the Conservative Party. And I remember this speech kind of clearly because she said, we're in opposition and we must escape the image of being the nasty party. And I thought there's something wrong with that statement. What is wrong with that statement? It's the image word. She didn't say we've got to stop being a nasty party. No, we just got to carry on being the nasty party, but make sure people don't know we're the nasty party. Very clever technique. And they got into power in 2010. They've been into power ever since. And of course, she went from being chairman of the Tory party to being Home Secretary. And then her tone changed. The truth came out. The image came to the fore. And she started complaining about people having fun with nitrous oxide, even if it wasn't harmful. So there she is as Home Secretary. She brought in the Psychoactive Substances Act. She was the daughter of the church, as you probably know. Her father was a vicar. And what she really meant is shown here. What she really meant was, thou shalt have no other drug but alcohol. So she's sipping away. Forever and ever, amen. And that's what the Psychoactive Substances Act says. It says basically, if you want to take a drug that has a degree of intoxication, the only drug you will ever be allowed to use in Britain legally is alcohol, which is rather unfortunate because, as I showed you at the beginning, alcohol is the most harmful drug in Britain. So we have a policy which is truly guaranteed to increase harms. Where does it all come from? Well, it all comes from the history of conservative politics in this country going back many hundreds of years, but being perpetuated by this group of individuals. This is the Bullingdon Club. And on those steps are two prime ministers. There's David Cameron there, looking rather young and innocent, saying, the proles, that's you and me, are complaining we'll ban nitrous oxide. And the current prime minister, who's sitting at the front here, Boris says, let them snort coke. That was good enough for us. And of course, the Bullingdon Club was notorious for its coke-fueled boozing evenings. If you haven't seen the film, The Riot Club, you should, because it's almost a documentary. But these people, of course, went from being heavy drug users and extreme intoxicated individuals to running the country. And by the way, this guy here now has become chairman of the Committee of Public Health Public Standards and Standards in Public Life. So basically, they had it sewn up for a long time, the Bullingdon Club. And the idea that you can get away with it when you're young and punish people who don't get away with it, I find really quite offensive. But it carries on. And this man is, some of you will probably know him. You know, he's actually arguably the second most important person in government today, Michael Gove. He wasn't in the Bullingdon Club, but he was a heavy cocaine user. And what was really despicable about him and his well-known cocaine parties, notorious parties, when he was an MP and possibly still going on, I don't know. But he was Minister of Education and he sacked teachers who were caught using cocaine. He was never caught, or if he was caught, he managed to pay off the police, we don't know. So he was never prosecuted. But he was prepared to live a life which he can get away with, but punish other people, necessary people like teachers, for being caught doing the same thing. I mean, that is truly obscene example of immoral double standards. And the psychoactive substances, I think, is the worst law ever, because it pushes people to use alcohol. It increases the harms and deaths through the black market. It's based on false premises, lies about harms. It bans safe substances outside, and it's anti-scientific. They didn't even bother to have a provision for research until we campaigned. In fact, there's only once ever been a worse law in Britain, and that was when the first Elizabeth Queen in 1559 banned Roman Catholicism. That's a moral law. So this is truly outrageous public policy, and it's largely driven, as I say, by newspapers. I'll finish by saying there's one other thing drug science has done, and that is use the multi-criteria decision approach to look if we could estimate better policies or the best policies. And this research was funded by the Norwegian government and the Research Council in Norway, because they were interested in how they might change their policies. And what we did was a very sophisticated analysis of the multiple harms and benefits of different policies on health, on social impact, etc. And it turned out both for alcohol and for cannabis, state control of the market gives you the best outcomes overall. So this is an interesting approach that can be rolled out to other drugs, and is, I would argue, the way in which decisions about drugs should be made in future. So I'm going to just finish by saying, what have we been trying to do? Well, we've been campaigning continuously to try to get the drugs out of the Home Office to the Department of Health, because we think drugs are a health issue, not a policing or a criminal issue. We've tried to encourage testing, and that's been quite a battle with many police forces not wanting to support it. As you've heard, we're supporting the evaluation of safe injecting rooms from Alex. And I think personally, but I'm not sure this is necessarily drug science policy, we should regulate access to drugs less harmful to users than alcohol. That's my own personal opinion. So I'll finish by reminding you how not only can you get ready for Christmas, but how you can also support drug science. These two books, all the proceeds of these two books go to the charity. This book's about me, and you should read this because you're the sort of age when I started thinking about this. Buy this book for your parents, because they'll then ask you what all the hard words mean, and you can have a dialogue with them. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic, as always. We've got time for just a couple of questions. I think we're wrapping up at 9, so we'll see what we can get through. So firstly, Hannah, just to start with a question for you. So it's sort of about what kind of skills do you think that people need, or people who are interested in volunteering for drug science and doing some of that work for them, like the blogs and the slides that you mentioned. What do you think are the best skills that people can have, and how they can sort of get involved using those?
So it kind of depends which side you're coming in from. You're coming from a scientific perspective, that scientific understanding as like a basis for being able to research literature. It's critically researching literature, so that's being thorough and making sure that when you look at sources and your different publications, you're comparing them whilst you're doing your research. And then it's that writing, it's being able to write in a scientific way, and then also being able to adapt it for a lay audience. So I say that if you're coming in from a scientific background, you come in from another background and just provide your expertise in that exact same way. It's your research, it's your planning, and it's the communication of whatever you've researched and planned, and then making sure that it's suitable for the audience that you're targeting, which most often it's your lay audience.
Definitely. Okay, thank you. And Dave, there's a question. I think this is something that comes up quite a lot as well. So someone has asked, and agrees that there's so much evidence showing how harmful alcohol is, and they agree that a lot of drugs need to be decriminalized. But what do you think the effect of decriminalizing these drugs would be? Would you see a shift to kind of increase in use? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, let's be clear about the difference between decriminalization and legalization. Decriminalization doesn't lead to more use generally. Legalization might, if drugs could be heavily marketed. That's why we did the policy MCDA, because, that's one of the reasons that state control came out top for both alcohol and cannabis, because it avoids the excessive increase in use that you'd get if you have a free market where there's a lot of advertising and a lot of promotion. And we got examples of that, obviously, particularly in the cannabis market in the States, where initially Colorado did have a free market with going for the maximum sales, but then it rolled back because there were clearly harms from people taking extremely strong doses or large doses of THC. So yes, I think a rational market actually would, in the end, be the best market, because it would reduce the harms of more harmful drugs like alcohol, but it would also massively undermine, or probably destroy, the black market, which of course is selling the most harmful drugs of all.
Definitely. And I can see that Alex has got his hand up, so don't know if he has something he'd like to add.
Just to say, there's been some really interesting research come out recently on what's happened since legalization of cannabis in those states that have legalized it. And some of the ways they've legalized cannabis in those states, Colorado's early example, California's, which is dominated by the industry, I've been very worried about. But even in those places, there doesn't seem to be much evidence that cannabis use is increasing amongst young people. It might be well increasing amongst middle-aged people, but who cares about 40 people as old as me using cannabis? Maybe we do care about children using cannabis and using it early, but that doesn't seem to be increasing in those states, at least so far. It might have different effects in the long term. I think it's interesting.
Well, there is an age. The point is, you've got to show your age certificate to get cannabis, whereas when you buy it from a shop, but you don't have to do it on the black market.
Yeah, definitely. I always think that's one of the most compelling arguments. And so another question for you, Dave, then is, and it's something I actually sometimes get asked as well, is people sometimes are concerned about their sort of careers as, I guess, young, particularly medical students, but also people kind of in the scientific field, quite concerned about kind of the stigma that might come with sort of promoting, it seems insane to say it, but just promoting sort of evidence-based policy and wanting to work with, what are now kind of illicit drugs, and kind of what would you say to people about how to kind of navigate that? Because obviously that's something you've come up against.
Yeah, well, the only way is to just keep banging on about the evidence. But I mean, I have to say, it won't be easy to create, for anyone, however good, to create a sole career out of working with illegal drugs. I mean, it's going to be let's look at us. The most successful psychedelic research group in the world. We've got 2 PNS papers. We've got papers in eLife. We've half the literature on brain imaging of psychedelics, and the 2 best trials have come out of our group. And in the 15 years we've been going, we've got 1 small grant from the Medical Research Council, and that tells you there is still prejudice. So my answer is very straightforward. Don't put all your eggs in the illegal drug basket. Try to do some other research as well. We could feed up. Try to get a scientific career of which this kind of research is part. It's easy.
Oh, have I frozen or is Dave frozen?
Maybe Dave.
I think Dave is frozen, but should we carry on if there's questions for Hannah?
Yep, I've got a question for Hannah. So this might be one I think is probably quite dear to a lot of students' hearts, but obviously you started out in a volunteering role for drug science and then made the transition to study coordinator in a kind of paid role. And how did that kind of, I mean, obviously I'm sure you did fantastic work, but what was that transition like and how did that come about?
So I think the great thing about the Honorary Research Assistant role was that I was working that role, I was volunteering that role alongside a paid role with a different charity, so I was able to kind of manage volunteering while still being paid from another role, so that worked really well. So that's good advice, whether you can take up the volunteering alongside another job. And then through my experience as an HRA, I kind of documented and could really clearly show all my different skills. You can kind of see that I did quite a broad set of projects with drug science. And then when the opportunity arose, it kind of meant I'd already demonstrated a lot of the skills firsthand already. And I think what lots of people struggle with is that stepping stone into drug science. How do you get involved? So often it's kind of just these little like steps that you kind of take. and then eventually you'll get kind of to somewhere that you're aiming for. So yeah, don't be put off if it takes a while. It can just be one book at a time. It's just getting your CV built up really, and also finding out what you're good at and finding out what you actually enjoy doing, because it might be that you find you don't really enjoy writing drug information pages, or might find that you really love it. So yeah, just take time to work out what it is you really enjoy.
Fantastic. Oh, and
we're back.
Yeah, Dave's back.
Where I went.
You've come back. I think we're going to gently wrap up now, unless there's anything else you wanted to add in at the end. No.
Well, except what, if you wanted an example of what drug science is, you've had it tonight. It's a remarkable organization with remarkable people. So please all sign up.
Please do. So thank you so much to all of our speakers. Obviously, Hannah and Dave, thank you for those fantastic talks and answering those questions. If you would be interested in volunteering with drug science or getting involved with the student organisations, I think James is going to put an email in the chat. You can find us on social media, on Twitter and Instagram. I think we're at Drug Science Soc, but quite easy to find on Google and things. If you're interested in Project 2021, then do get in touch with Mags and have a look on the Drug Science website. I think you can sign up to the mailing list there. Also, just generally have a look at the Drug Science website. It's great, and there's so many really, really interesting kind of articles you can read there, and great bits of kind of educational resources. Even if you want to do sort of peer-to-peer education, that's a great starting point.